Over the past few years, there have been countless instances where black people have mysteriously vanished from states all across America, but despite the controversy that surrounds their cases, to this day, they all remain unsolved. From possible human trafficking to the hidden reality of modern-day sundown towns, the victims of these practices seem to have been forgotten about by the media, with local police also refusing to keep their cases alive. Now, if you are familiar with my channel, then you will likely be aware of my running series where I take a deeper look into these cases in an attempt to try and spread awareness. But unfortunately, for the vast majority of victims I've covered this year, their cases still remain unsolved. So as we approach the end of 2024, in this video I have decided to compile all of the unsolved cases which I covered this year into one complete collection, to give these victims a second chance of exposure by revisiting their stories and maybe even uncovering a detail which you might have missed the first time around. So without further ado, I can think of no better place to start than with one of the most controversial cases of 2024, the disturbing disappearance of Tyler Blake Weathersby. On Wednesday the 4th of September, just last month, a 31-year-old father from Sioux Falls in South Dakota named Tyler Blake Weathersby left his home early in the morning heading out for what was supposed to be a short walk. However, Tyler mysteriously never returned, and despite extensive searches, he has not been seen since. In the days following his disappearance, Tyler's family noticed he had left behind both his wallet and phone. So concerned for his safety, they reported him missing to the Sioux Falls Police Department, who then coordinated searches in the nearby areas Tyler was known to frequent. Over the next few weeks, law enforcement exhausted over 100 different leads, as the public rallied together to help locate Tyler as quickly as possible. However, no substantial sightings would ever emerge, and by late September, police reported during a press conference that more leads were required. So, determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, in the days following the announcement, Tyler's family and the local community continued to push for answers, with authorities urging anyone with information to step forward. And as a result of these efforts, an interesting theory would soon emerge surrounding Tyler's very own wife, who was allegedly involved in the death of her ex-boyfriend in 2017. However, despite the exhaustive searches and community support over the past 8 weeks, Tyler remains a missing person to this day, which has understandably left many to wonder what really happened to Tyler Weathersby, and who could be responsible. Tyler Blake Weathersby was born in the year 1993 to his loving parents in the city of Chicago, alongside his brother Gregory, who he was particularly close with. While details of Tyler's early childhood are limited, his family and friends always described him as an incredibly active and positive individual who especially enjoyed spending time outdoors. According to his brother, he was also a very ambitious person, as from a young age, Tyler was able to demonstrate his talents for taking things apart and putting them back together, which was something that would later fuel the role he would play in Gregory's creative work. Growing up, the brothers would spend a lot of time together, fending for themselves on the busy streets of Chicago, but once they were old enough, they decided to move out west to LA to pursue dreams of starting a media company together, where Tyler would focus on the more creative tasks like producing music and videos, whilst Gregory would be more responsible for the business side of things. However, despite the rising success that Tyler was experiencing, his life wasn't perfect, as unfortunately he would suffer a number of setbacks that would inevitably cause him to have to return home to the Midwest, where he would eventually settle in the city of Sioux Falls in South Dakota. But soon after arriving, Tyler quickly began to assimilate himself into the local community, and even developed a reputation for being dedicated and driven as he worked locally and had a steady routine that kept him connected to the rest of the city. But it wasn't just his career choices that demonstrated his hard-working nature, as at some point during his late 20s, Tyler would meet a woman named Mona Lisa Perez, who would go on to become an extremely important figure in his life, as the pair would eventually marry and bring a child into the world. However, just as the parents were beginning to prepare for their baby's first birthday, an event would take place that would rock the entire community of Sioux Falls, when Tyler would mysteriously disappear on that fateful day in September. On Wednesday the 4th of September, the 31-year-old man left his home in Sioux Falls in the early hours of the morning, telling his family he was just heading out for a quick walk. At first, it just seemed like any other day, and there were no indications that Tyler had any unusual plans. However, as the day wore on, Tyler didn't return home, and his family grew increasingly concerned, knowing it was unlike him to disappear without notifying somebody first. But the situation would only get worse when the next day Tyler's family discovered that he had left his phone and wallet at home, which understandably deepened their worries about his safety. Searches were quickly organised by the family, who began combing through the areas he was known to frequent, but despite their efforts, no traces of Tyler were initially found. Local witnesses offered limited information, with a few unconfirmed reports of somebody matching Tyler's description seen in the area, although during these conversations nothing definitive ever emerged. So, with his family now fearing the worst, they decided that they had no other option but to file an official missing persons report with the local police, hoping that it wouldn't be too long until he would be found. On Thursday the 5th of September, the Sioux Falls Police Department received a call from Tyler's family, who had become increasingly alarmed after not hearing from him for over 24 hours. They then went on to inform the police about how Tyler had left his house early the previous morning for what was supposed to be just a short walk, and how he hadn't returned or even reached out ever since. But to make matters even more troubling, his family were also extremely concerned given the fact that he had left both his wallet and cell phone behind, which was not only uncharacteristic of him, but also something which could have potentially been quite dangerous, with Tyler possessing no immediate method of contacting his family if required. So, in response to their pleas for help, the Sioux Falls police opened an official investigation into his sudden disappearance, deciding to start by interviewing family, friends and neighbours to establish his recent routines and any potential signs of distress. They also went on to review local surveillance footage with the aim of trying to track his last known movements after leaving the house that day. However, at first, they were unfortunately unable to find anything substantial to help with the case, other than an eerie video clip from a neighbour's doorbell camera, which showed Tyler walking along the street shortly after leaving the home. So, given the lack of concrete information on what happened to Tyler after he disappeared, the police then expanded their search efforts, deploying drones and ground teams to cover the areas Tyler was known to frequent. The investigation also saw collaboration with volunteers and private search teams, which were organised by Tyler's family and friends, who at the time remained hopeful for his safe return. However, after countless days of searching, there were still no physical signs of Tyler, or any further leads that would allude to his whereabouts. So, with public interest growing around the case, the Sioux Falls police then decided to hold a press conference, urging anyone with information to come forward, and almost immediately hundreds of tips began to flood in, giving the police hope that this would be the big break they needed in the case. But despite their hard work and unwavering optimism, the police would soon be devastated to find out that every single tip would lead to a dead end, leaving Tyler's family distraught as they were only left to wonder what could have happened to their loved one. So, with time running out and public pressure rising, the police were left with no other option but to start thinking outside the box. And in a surprising twist of fate, it would be during this period in particular that some very interesting theories would be raised about who could be responsible. On Wednesday the 11th of September, exactly 1 week after Tyler's disappearance, the Sioux Falls Police Department held another press conference to update the public, as the pressure had been mounting with each passing day. During their speech, the police revealed that Tyler's phone and wallet were left at his home, and his family expressed concern, explaining that it was entirely unlike Tyler not to check in or at least keep in touch. The family emphasized that Tyler was a dependable person and his sudden disappearance was profoundly out of his character. Authorities then went on to address various different theories at the press conference, with the idea that this may have helped spark some further leads from the public. While initially considering the possibility that Tyler might have left on his own accord, they confirmed that they were keeping all options open, including potential foul play. However, they also admitted that at the time there were no signs of evidence pointing definitively in any direction, making it necessary to continue exploring all possibilities going forward. During the conference, Tyler's family strongly refuted the idea that he may have been in distress, describing him as a positive and stable person before his disappearance. So in response to these updates, the wider community came together with Tyler's family and friends to help aid in his safe return, whilst the police continued to conduct their investigation, with some members of the public expressing their interest in Tyler's wife as a potential suspect, given her sketchy romantic past, which involved the accidental shooting of her ex-boyfriend in 2017. However, despite numerous leads and countless searches of the local area, to this day the mystery surrounding Tyler's disappearance remains unsolved, with only speculation remaining about what could have happened to the young father. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite these difficult circumstances, Tyler's family are refusing to give up hope, as after all, there is still every chance that he could return home any day now. And with the media attention rising with each day, they believe it will only be a matter of time before he is found safe and alive. However, given that Tyler has now been missing for almost 2 months, alongside the incredibly concerning details that surround his case, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of his safe return is only growing weaker as time passes. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before we dive into the theories themselves, as always, I first wanted to acknowledge Tyler's family, who are no doubt experiencing some immense feelings of grief in this difficult time. So, given the sensitive nature of this situation, I feel it's important to remind you that we have to approach any potential explanations behind his disappearance with the utmost respect and understanding. As with all of my previous videos, the theories I'm about to delve into have been shared by his family, law enforcement, or media sources. But given the many unknowns surrounding Tyler's disappearance, for now, these theories remain nothing more than speculation, as so far no concrete evidence has emerged that points definitively to any particular scenario. But with that being said, one theory that is being heavily considered by the local community is that Tyler may have been involved in an accident during his walk, potentially near a remote or secluded area, which would explain why he left his phone behind and why he has not been found. After all, if he was only supposed to be going for a walk and he was familiar with the area, he might not have had any need for a cell phone. However, this theory fails to explain how he could have gotten lost on his own accord if he did know the area well, so it would be highly unlikely that he would not be able to find his way home after the walk. Another theory that has been spoken about revolves around Tyler's mental health, as concerns were raised that he may have experienced a personal crisis in the days before his disappearance, which could have led him to spontaneously run away or even become disoriented during the walk. However, Tyler's family has expressed strong doubts about this theory, stating that it doesn't align with his usual behaviour or values to suddenly just go silent. They acknowledge that everyone faces personal struggles, but Tyler's family believe that if he was struggling at the time, he would have surely asked for some support or at least shared any plans with his family. There were also no signs of an accident near the areas Tyler would frequent, which allows for the possibility that he wandered off during a moment of distress. But given the fact that Tyler left many personal belongings behind, this situation doesn't appear to have been a long-term planned departure, which raises further questions about what might have happened. But before I get too carried away, we have to keep in mind that until further evidence comes to light that proves nobody else was involved with Tyler's disappearance, we unfortunately need to keep an open mind that it is still very possible that somebody else could be responsible. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is no concrete evidence to explicitly confirm any of these theories. However, there are many people coming forward who speculate that foul play is the most likely explanation, given the lack of information that has been shared by the police and the absence of any real clues. Also, law enforcement have stated during a press conference that although they are still treating this as a missing persons case, they have not ruled out the possibility of foul play if new information arises. So with this in mind, the local community as well as Tyler's family continue to hold on to hope that someone might come forward with relevant evidence that can help shine a light on what really happened that day. But taking a small step back, I feel it's important to mention that there has been some curiosity surrounding the background of Tyler's very own wife, due to a fatal accident involving her former boyfriend, and after it was revealed that just days before Tyler went missing, she allegedly inquired about his life insurance policies. Back in 2017, Mona Lisa Perez, who was just 20 years old at the time, tragically took the life of her former boyfriend, Pedro Ruiz III, who was also the father of her 2 children. During a YouTube stunt, Pedro held a thick book close to his chest, believing it would be capable of stopping a bullet. But as you can probably imagine, this would turn out to be a grave mistake, as the bullet would pierce through the book and fatally wounded him. The incident was captured on camera, and Mona Lisa later pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter before she was sentenced to 180 days in jail, with a plea agreement that prohibited her from profiting off the video and barred her from owning firearms for life. So with this story in mind, it cannot be ignored that if Tyler is found to be deceased, Mona Lisa Perez will therefore be connected to multiple spousal deaths, which is certainly something worth looking into, especially given her alleged inquiry into Tyler's life insurance policies. However, it must be said that no substantial links to Tyler's case have been found so far, and reports indicate that the incident involving her ex-boyfriend was nothing more than an accident. But nonetheless, determined to uncover the truth, the Weathersby family have since hired a private investigation agency to further explore every possible lead. But at least for now, there is still no definitive theory that has come to light, meaning Tyler's family can only continue to advocate for public support with the hopes that they can bring their loved one home, or at the very least, find the answers that they so desperately deserve. On Sunday the 21st of June in 2020, a 44-year-old mother of 6 named Dawnita Wilkerson was last seen getting into a vehicle with 2 unidentified men in the parking lot of the Roadway Inn Motel in Evansville, Indiana, before she would mysteriously vanish, never to be seen again. The next morning, her family noticed that her phone had been switched off at around 9 AM, as any attempts to get in touch past this time would go directly to her voicemail, leading them to worry that she may have been in danger. So, concerned for her safety, Dawnita's mother decided to contact the Evansville Police Department to report her daughter as missing, as this behaviour was extremely unusual. However, despite the hard work of the investigators, who conducted countless searches throughout the local neighbourhoods over the course of multiple years, to this day the mother of 6 still remains a missing person, and her case appears to have gone cold. So, given these troubling details, it is no surprise that after 4 long years of searching, Dawnita's family have been left heartbroken, as they are only left to wonder, what really happened to Dawnita Wilkerson, and more importantly, where could she be? Dawnita Layuta Wilkerson was born on the 14th of March in 1976 to her loving mother Hope in the city of Evansville, Indiana, alongside her incredibly close-knit family. Not too much is known about her childhood, but what we do know is that from a young age, Dawnita was already being described as a warm and loving person who was always willing to help others when given the opportunity. Her family and friends were also quick to notice her strong sense of nurture and responsibility, as she would later become a mother to 6 beautiful children, with her first arriving when she was just 22 years old. As she moved deeper into her adult life, Dawnita would go on to become a lifelong resident of Evansville with strong ties to her local community, which she cared for deeply, and it was due to these close relationships alongside the love she had for her children that would inevitably give Dawnita her iconic zest for life that her friends would describe as infectious. However, just a few months after her 44th birthday, an event would take place that would send shockwaves throughout the small city of Evansville, when Dawnita would mysteriously disappear on that fateful day in June. On Sunday the 21st of June, the 44-year-old woman was supposed to be spending the day at her brother's house alongside one of her daughters, before she would suddenly decide to head out the door, promising her daughter that she would be right back. However, hours would continue to tick by, with Dawnita failing to return to the house. So, given these troubling details, her family began to worry that something may have happened to her. According to them, it was not typical behaviour for Dawnita to be away from her children for too long, so as the day soon turned to night, with still no sign of the missing mother, they started to call around her friends who they hoped may have known where she could be. But to their dismay, not a single person had heard from her, leaving the family confused as to where Dawnita could have gone. However, wanting to stay positive, they decided to give her the benefit of the doubt, as for all they knew, she could have made plans that she wanted to keep secret, and so they didn't want to raise the alarm bells too prematurely. So, praying that they would wake up the next day to a text or missed call from their loved one, the family eventually made the difficult decision to call it a night and wait for an update in the morning. However, when the next day came with still no contact from Dawnita, the family attempted to get in touch with her one last time by calling her cell phone, but to their horror, this time the call would go directly to voicemail, meaning that her phone had been shut off and it would therefore be impossible to get a hold of her. So, petrified that her life could have been in danger, Dawnita's mother Hope felt she had no choice but to call the local police to report her 44-year-old daughter as missing. On Monday the 22nd of June, the Evansville Police Department would receive a call from a concerned mother who was desperately trying to locate her missing daughter. According to Hope Wilkerson, Dawnita would have never just suddenly left her family behind, as she was usually in constant contact with her 6 children who she loved deeply. So, given the fact that nobody could get a hold of her because her phone had been switched off, the police agreed to open a missing person case and immediately headed over to her brother's house where she was last seen. After conducting some initial interviews, it was then revealed that Dawnita had promised her daughter that she would be returning to the house soon, so detectives then began checking local surveillance footage to see if they could track her last known whereabouts. And soon enough, they were able to uncover that Dawnita had travelled over to the Roadway Inn motel, which was located on the outskirts of Evansville. And after further inspecting the local surveillance footage, they spotted what appeared to be Dawnita getting into a vehicle with 2 unidentified men. Now, it is unclear whether her presence at the hotel was initially identified through credit card transactions or phone records, but what we do know is that once they located her whereabouts, the surveillance footage went on to play a key role in determining her movements before she disappeared. So, after making this disturbing discovery, the Evansville Police Department then held a press conference the following day, where they explained how Dawnita had been captured on the motel surveillance camera at approximately 8:16 p.m. on that Sunday evening, as she was getting into a silver 2004 Chevy Suburban, which supposedly belonged to an acquaintance. However, the police never could have predicted what would happen next, as just a few days after the press conference, they would soon manage to track down the owners of the vehicle. On Wednesday the 15th of July, almost 1 month after her disappearance, the police would announce that after speaking with the owners of the vehicle that Dawnita was last seen getting into at the Roadway Inn motel, they were still no closer to finding out the truth, as the suspect would refuse to divulge any information and remained firm that he had no idea what had happened to the missing mother. So, with this lead eventually seeming to go cold, the police had no choice but to increase their efforts in the investigation, as they began searching local wooded areas and abandoned buildings, as well as waterways where her body could have been disposed of. They were also able to get the FBI involved in the case, given the fact that Dawnita had been missing for several weeks at this point, with not a single witness to come forward with a confirmed sighting. However, despite the massive efforts of everybody involved, including the enormous amount of resources provided by the FBI, and a $5,000 reward for any information pertaining to her case, Dawnita continues to remain a missing person to this day, leaving her family understandably devastated as they wait patiently for answers. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite these rather bleak circumstances, Dawnita's family are refusing to give up hope, as after 4 years of searching, they continue to spread awareness for their missing loved one to this day. And over the years, there have been several tips provided by the public, including a possible sighting in the remote area of Henderson, Kentucky, so there is reason to believe that she could possibly be out there somewhere. Press conferences are also held every year on the anniversary of Dawnita's disappearance, and the FBI have increased the associated reward money in recent months, in an effort to drive more attention towards the case. However, given that Dawnita Wilkerson has now been missing for over 4 years, alongside the worrying details of her case, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of her safe return is only growing weaker as the time passes. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I get into the theories themselves, I just wanted to take some time to address the current state of my channel, as you may have noticed that my upload schedule has been a bit all over the place in recent months. The fact is, I have had to remove a few videos due to families getting in touch about their unhappiness with my format, most likely due to the darker elements of the theorizing I do on this channel. Now, as I hope many of you already know, the aim of these videos is and has always been to raise awareness for victims who are not getting the media attention they deserve. This is the reason why I feel the need to add darker tones to my titles and thumbnails, as without the controversy, it's very difficult to gain attention on YouTube with the sea of true crime content that is out there. But given the recent complaints I've been receiving from families, I feel I have no choice but to tone down the darkness of these videos and try to focus more on the story, as I can understand why speculation may cause concerns for those who are closer to the case. Saying this, however, I will still try to discuss any theories that the family have spoken about online, as I would hope that by at least drawing attention, this will be appreciated by all those involved in the case. So with this in mind, let's begin by discussing why her family think Dawnita left that day, and what they think could have happened to her. Now, there have been several theories floating around the internet about what could have happened to Dawnita, but there is very little information to suggest why she left the house that day. She provided no further details to anybody in her family about where she was going, only expressing how she would be back soon. So the only assumption her family can make is that she was meeting up with somebody she knew, or she was intercepted by somebody while she was running errands. So given the distinct lack of evidence to provide a clear enough explanation for why she left, I think our time would be better spent discussing what could have happened to her after going missing, as perhaps this can help reveal why she decided to leave that day. So the first theory to discuss would be that she was met with foul play, with the most likely suspects being the men she was seen with that day at the motel. According to her family, in the days building up to her disappearance, Dawnita had communicated that she was concerned for her safety due to certain individuals she was associated with. This suggested that she may have been involved with people who had ill intentions, and therefore, police felt the need to question several individuals known to be in contact with her prior to her disappearance. But just because a suspect hasn't been arrested, doesn't mean that this theory is unlikely, as it's still very possible that someone she trusted may have lured her into a dangerous situation that day, before ultimately taking her life. Dawnita's family have also expressed the possibility that she could have been involved in human trafficking, as she was last seen at a motel, which could align with the profile of trafficking cases, where individuals are moved around and held in transient locations such as this. Plus, her sudden disappearance, lack of contact, and lack of activity on her phone could also suggest that she was taken against her will, and possibly trafficked after being lured away by someone she trusted. But if she was trafficked by somebody she knew, who could this person actually be? Well, another theory posed by her family is that Dawnita's disappearance could be connected to a previous relationship, as she had previously been in relationships that may have involved conflict or threats, leading to the possibility that somebody from her past may have wanted to harm her. This theory is especially considered due to the fact that she expressed fears to her family, and she was also seen in a vulnerable state when captured on that surveillance footage. However, before I get too carried away, I must remind you that until we have concrete evidence to back up any of these claims, for now they remain nothing more than theories. So with this in mind, please make sure to be respectful in the comments and share this story with as many people as you can, as I'm sure the Wilkerson family would be eternally grateful for your support. On Thursday the 3rd of October, just earlier this month, a 28-year-old Broadway actor named Zelig Williams mysteriously disappeared from his family home in Columbia, South Carolina, and hasn't been seen since. Shortly after he left, one of his friends received an SOS signal from his cell phone which was reporting that Zelig had crashed his car. But strangely, when the police were finally able to track down the vehicle a few days later, the car was discovered in near perfect condition, abandoned on the Palmetto Trail near the Congaree National Park. Upon further inspection, the police were also able to uncover several items that belonged to Zelig, which led the investigators to theorize that he may have been forced to abandon his vehicle. However, despite conducting numerous searches across the vast remote area, alongside the efforts of his family who have been pleading with the public for help, after 3 weeks of investigating, there has still been no sign of the missing performer, which has understandably led the public to wonder what really happened to Zelig Williams, and why do so many people of colour continue to go missing in recent times. Zelig Williams was born in the year 1996 in the city of Columbia, South Carolina, where he grew up alongside his close-knit and loving family. From a young age, Zelig was always drawn to dance and performance, where he developed a true passion for theatre early on, performing in a school production of The Wizard of Oz as a child. Not too much else is known about his childhood, but it was clear from an early age that Zelig had an immense talent and ambition which he demonstrated in every performance. So, after graduating from the University of South Carolina, he then decided to pursue a career as a professional dancer, where he managed to land prominent roles in major productions as a rising star within the Broadway community, including many well-known shows such as Hamilton or MJ the Musical. However, despite his meteoric rise into the world of Broadway, this seemingly perfect life appeared to be causing strain on Zelig's mental state, as he would strangely decide to return home to Columbia, which marked a significant transition in his life. According to his family, Zelig had reportedly taken a step back from his career to focus on his faith, as he had been struggling with a number of issues that needed attention. But during this period of rest, an event would eventually take place that would send shockwaves throughout the entire Broadway community, when Zelig would mysteriously disappear on that fateful day in October. On Thursday the 3rd of October, the 28-year-old professional dancer was last seen leaving his South Carolina home, where he had been temporarily living with his family after deciding to leave his career behind in search of a spiritual awakening. According to his family, Zelig had left the house that day without giving any indication of his whereabouts or plans, so as hours continued to pass by with no contact, his family began to grow concerned, knowing that it was unusual for Zelig to simply go off the grid without informing anyone. However, the situation would soon escalate further when that very same day an SOS signal was sent from Zelig's phone to a friend in New York, which stated that he had been in a car accident, understandably raising further concerns towards his absence. The signal reportedly originated from the Palmetto Trail near the Congaree National Park, a large forested area just outside of Columbia, making his already disturbing disappearance even more alarming. So, in response to this harrowing update, his family reached out to as many friends as they could and searched for possible signs of where he might have gone. But despite their immense efforts to track down Zelig, they were unfortunately met with silence, as nobody was able to verify seeing Zelig that day or even comment about what could have happened to him. And to make matters even worse, calls to Zelig's phone were now going straight to voicemail, indicating that it was either turned off or out of service. So, fearing the worst, his family decided that they had no other option but to call the local police to officially report Zelig Williams as missing. On Friday the 4th of October, the Richland County Sheriff's Department received a call from a devastated family who were becoming increasingly concerned by their loved one's absence. According to them, Zelig had not been in touch since leaving home the day before, and it was highly unusual for him to go without communication for such an extended period. They mentioned how his phone had been turned off a few hours after sending out an SOS signal the previous day, leading them to believe that something could be seriously wrong. So in response to their pleas for help, the police quickly opened an investigation into his disappearance and began conducting interviews with his family and those close to him. Given that his phone's SOS signal had been traced to an area near the Congaree National Park, officers immediately started combing through local surveillance footage and cell phone data to try and establish Zelig's last known movements. And fortunately, it didn't take too long before the police managed to discover Zelig's car abandoned near a remote section of the Palmetto Trail close to the national park. And after inspecting the vehicle, they found a number of items which belonged to the missing young man. This development then led to a large-scale search operation involving law enforcement, search and rescue teams and local volunteers. Search dogs and drones were also deployed to cover the dense forest in the hopes of finding clues as to Zelig's whereabouts. However, despite their efforts, after several days of searching, there were still no immediate signs of Zelig in the area where his car was found. So with nowhere else to turn, the police then decided to hold a press conference to appeal for more information from the public, emphasizing that Zelig's disappearance was highly unusual and that his family were desperate for answers. But it wouldn't be long before another massive update to the story would soon hit the media, which would cause the police to increase their efforts out of fear that Zelig may have been in serious danger. On Wednesday the 9th of October, it was revealed to the public in a press conference that Zelig had not only left his family home that day without telling anybody where he was going, but that he had also decided not to take his medication with him, meaning that he was more than likely in a very vulnerable state. According to his family, Zelig had been taking the medication for a mental health issue, and so without it, he would have been left disoriented, leading to concerns that he may have wandered into the dense forest and gotten himself lost. However, to make matters even more harrowing, the police also revealed during the press conference that they were not ruling out foul play, as this behaviour was very much unlike Zelig, and therefore it was possible that he was lured out to the Palmetto Trail by somebody who had ill intentions. But with little to no hard evidence to back this theory up, for now the community are trying to stay positive that it will only be a matter of time before Zelig is found alive. And so, until then, the police will continue to do everything they can to find him before it's too late. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite these rather bleak circumstances, Zelig's family are refusing to give up hope, as after all, there is still every chance that he could turn up safe. There has also been an increase in media attention around the case after the famous Hollywood actor Hugh Jackman took to social media to plead with the public for help, as the pair had actually worked together in 2019 on one of his shows, meaning that he was able to raise the profile of the case to his millions of followers. However, despite these positive updates, given that Zelig Williams has now been missing for over 3 weeks, alongside the incredibly concerning details of his case, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of his safe return is only growing weaker as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I dive into the theories themselves, I just wanted to express my deepest sympathies to Zelig's family, as I can only imagine the immense pain and worry that they must be feeling in this difficult time. I also feel it's important to mention that given the many unknowns and the emotional nature of this situation, it's so important to be respectful when discussing potential explanations for what might have happened to Zelig. Some of the following theories have been shared by his family, law enforcement or the media, but I still want to stress that these theories are purely speculative at this moment in time, as so far in the case, no concrete evidence has been uncovered that definitively points to any one scenario. But with that being said, one possibility that could have a potentially positive outcome is that Zelig may have voluntarily disappeared due to personal reasons. This theory has been discussed due to some significant changes in his life, such as his decision to leave his role on Broadway for religious reasons and move back home to South Carolina. Additionally, there are also some major concerns about his mental health, as Zelig was not taking his prescribed medication at the time, and some people have raised the idea that Zelig may have intentionally walked away or become disoriented during a mental health crisis. However, his family doesn't entirely buy into this theory, as they've made it clear that it's unlike Zelig to suddenly stop communicating with them, especially after an SOS signal was sent from his phone. His loved ones have acknowledged his mental health challenges, but they still believe something more serious might have happened, as it just doesn't align with his usual behaviour to vanish without any sign or message. What's interesting here is that there were no signs of an accident or a struggle found near Zelig's car, which leaves room for the possibility that he may have just wandered off, perhaps during a moment of distress. But once again, I must remind you that we don't have any hard evidence to confirm this, and it's also worth noting that some of his personal belongings were left behind, which could suggest that whatever happened, it might not have been a planned long-term disappearance. So even if this theory is proven to be true, there are still no assurances that Zelig will necessarily turn up safe, which is why it's so important that we continue to spread awareness of his case. But if for argument's sake, Zelig's disappearance is not related to his mental health struggles, another theory which I've seen being mentioned online is the possibility that he might have had an accident while exploring the Palmetto Trail, given that his car was discovered near Congaree National Park. It's not uncommon for people to visit that area for hiking or outdoor activities, so it would make sense that Zelig could have been out there on his own. The SOS alert that came from his phone shortly after he disappeared does seem to support this idea, as it might have been a distress signal from someone in trouble. However, it's important to note that while this theory has been floated around, there hasn't been any concrete evidence found to back it up. Authorities have combed through the surrounding areas, including difficult to reach spots along the trail, but it's a large and heavily wooded area, so searching it thoroughly is a huge challenge. Another thing to keep in mind is the rugged terrain and wildlife in that part of the park. People in the community, as well as those following the case in the media, have pointed out how easy it would be for somebody to become lost, injured, or worse. But while I can't say for sure if this theory is accurate, it's one that many have considered as a possibility, even though nothing definitive has come from it yet. Which would be the same case for this next theory, which covers the idea that foul play could have been involved in Zelig's case, a theory which is especially popular among law enforcement and media outlets. And it's not too surprising to see why. The situation does certainly raise significant questions, particularly because Zelig's car was discovered abandoned in a remote location he rarely visited, and his sudden disappearance following an SOS signal is also very alarming. But to add further fuel to this theory, another point that is being made by the public is that there is a distinct lack of clear physical evidence suggesting an accident. And due to these circumstances, reports show that police are investigating any possible interactions Zelig may have had in the lead-up to his disappearance. In addition, to add further credibility to this theory, Zelig's family is understandably troubled by the notion of foul play, with his aunt in particular voicing her opinion about the unusual circumstances surrounding his disappearance, indicating that if foul play was indeed involved, this would imply that the perpetrator acted quickly and left minimal traces, which is why investigators are approaching this angle with absolute caution. However, the fact of the matter is, until more physical evidence comes forward which points to a potential car crash or a struggle of some kind, we will never know for sure about what happened that day. But with the little evidence that has come forward so far, perhaps this could be because Zelig isn't in any danger at all, and in fact, some people believe that there's a possibility that he could have chosen to disappear for personal reasons. Now, as I've already stated, there are several different theories floating around which speculate on what could have happened to Zelig Williams, but during my research there was one theory in particular which stuck out to me, which suggests that he may have been undergoing a significant personal transformation after recently leaving his role in MJ the Musical for more than just religious reasons. This career shift immediately sparked speculation that it could have influenced his decision to vanish that day, as he may have been struggling with his identity, leading to some impulsive decisions. However, to this day, this theory remains completely unsubstantiated by his family, as in their opinion, there is simply no clear evidence to suggest he would ever abandon his life so suddenly and mysteriously. In fact, Zelig's family have been emphasizing that he regularly communicated with them and that it would be highly out of character for him to leave without any explanation. But despite these statements from the family, some members of the public continue to speculate that Zelig might have been trying to distance himself from his past life, and therefore may have gone into hiding to start fresh. However, although this theory would allude to a much happier ending, I can't help but feel that this one is a long shot, especially given that law enforcement continues to explore all possibilities with no definitive explanations emerging around why Zelig left his home that day. So in summary, based on the statements from the police, Zelig's family and the media, it would seem that the leading theories in this case currently include a mental health crisis, an accident, or even foul play, with abduction and personal transformation also being discussed. But until we have further information from the investigating officers, for now we can only continue to pray and help spread awareness of this case, with the hopes that by doing so, it will lead this grieving family to a happy ending, where they can be reunited with their loved one, once and for all. On Thursday the 1st of February, just earlier this year, a 16-year-old girl named Asata Amun was captured by her doorbell camera running out of her house with no shoes on her feet before she would mysteriously disappear. The next day, she was reported missing by her father Kwabena after he watched the footage from the night before, but despite leaving in her bright pink pajamas, no witnesses would ever come forward. In the days leading up to the incident, Asata had complained to her mother Jasmine that she didn't want to stay with her father anymore, but given their parental agreement, there wasn't much that could be done. However, it would be revealed months later that the couple had actually divorced due to the fact that Kwabena had been abusive in the relationship. So once the police were made aware of this, they immediately decided to conduct a search of the property. But even after bringing Kwabena in for questioning and seizing as much evidence as they could, to this day the case remains unsolved, and the missing teenager is still yet to be found, leaving her family understandably devastated, as they are only left to wonder what really happened to Asata Amun, and more importantly, who could be responsible. Asata Amun was born in the late 2000s to her parents Jasmine Dominique and Kwabena Amun in the state of Connecticut, where she grew up alongside the rest of her family. Not too much is known about her childhood, but what we do know is that Asata was always described as a kind and intelligent girl who flourished in school and had her heart set on a bright future. However, in her teenage years, her parents would unfortunately decide to get a divorce, with Jasmine claiming that her husband was being abusive. But despite her incriminating statements, surprisingly the courts still sided with Kwabena, which meant that Asata and her sisters were forced to move in with him, only getting to see their mother on the weekends. But to make matters even worse, Kwabena would eventually decide to move out to Atlanta, Georgia, which was located almost 1,000 miles away from her mother Jasmine, meaning Asata was left even further isolated with a father that had apparently been abusive in the past. Now, it was never clarified if this abuse was mental or physical, but either way it can't have been an easy upbringing for Asata, so unfortunately it was not too surprising when her grades started to slip and she began to get in trouble at North Gwinnett High School as she grew more and more distant from her family. According to Jasmine, on multiple occasions she would receive phone calls and text messages from Asata begging to be picked up and taken away from her Atlanta home, but given the court-appointed agreement there was nothing that could be done. And so it would seem that Asata would continue to slip deeper into the darkness, with her father eventually threatening to send her to military school if she didn't do as she was told. However, despite her many pleas for help, the teenager would continue to remain under her father's authority until that fateful day in February when she would mysteriously vanish without a trace. On Thursday the 1st of February, the 16-year-old girl had found herself in the middle of a heated discussion with her father about her recent actions, as she had apparently been misbehaving at school. The pair would then continue to debate about this subject throughout the day, until the heated discussion eventually erupted into a full-blown argument, as Asata began to raise her voice at the prospect of being sent to military school. However, refusing to back down, Kwabena stood firm that if she didn't agree to change her ways, he would be signing her up to the academy. So in a moment of spontaneous panic, the teenager then rushed out of the house in her pajamas with no shoes on her feet, seemingly heading towards a friend's house to cool off. Now, according to Kwabena, he didn't actually notice that she had left the home in her pajamas until after checking the doorbell camera footage, so I can only assume that he did not physically see her leave, as otherwise surely he would have rushed after her. Then again, I suppose it's also possible that he was aware that she'd left, but only became concerned after seeing the camera footage, as she was wearing no shoes in the month of February. But either way, the one thing that is for certain is that after running out of the house, Asata would soon disappear into the night, causing her father to panic that she could have been in trouble. And so, after calling around her friends' houses and realizing that she had not arrived safely, Kwabena felt he had no other option but to report his teenage daughter as missing to the local police. On Friday the 2nd of February, the Gwinnett Police Department would receive a call from a concerned father after he explained how his 16-year-old daughter had left the house the previous night in nothing but her pajamas, and how he had been unable to get a hold of her since. According to Kwabena, although it was not unlike his daughter to run away from home, the fact that none of her usual friends had seen her was a huge red flag, especially given the fact that she had left the house with no shoes on her feet. So, keen to assist with the situation, the police decided to send out officers to the residence to conduct an official interview with the family, as they needed to know more about Asata before they started following any potential leads. During this conversation, it was quickly uncovered that the teenager had likely run away from home to avoid going to military school, and that she was probably hiding out somewhere until it was safe to return. However, after the police were provided with the doorbell footage of Asata leaving the residence, they quickly began to take the case much more seriously, as it appeared that she was not just running away from home, but potentially running for her life. So, concerned with the situation, the officers then returned to the police station and opened up an official investigation to the case, as they were determined to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. But despite working hard to uncover leads, days would soon turn into weeks, with the young woman remaining missing with not a single sighting coming forward in the months she had been missing. So, worried that the case was slipping out of reach, Asata's family then turned to the media for help, as they hoped by spreading the story this may have led to more leads and would have hopefully led to the discovery of their missing daughter. However, these pleas for help would seem to fall on deaf ears, as potential witnesses would continue to remain silent and the news reports would receive barely any attention from the public, with some YouTube videos getting less than 300 views. So, 4 months on from the disappearance, it seemed as if the case had already gone cold, as the police were still struggling to find any new leads and nobody was willing to come forward. But just as the case appeared to be running out of steam, a major update would soon burst onto the scene, after Asata's very own father would be revealed as a potential suspect. On Friday the 14th of June, an official warrant was obtained by the Gwinnett Police Department to search the home of Dawnita Amun, after it was uncovered that he had a criminal history of abuse, which would become more and more apparent as his cooperation with the police began to decline. But alongside this, after arriving at the home, detectives would go on to seize a dolly, gardening tools, several pairs of shoes, and even Kwabena's very own personal vehicle. They also used Blue Star technology to look for dried or cleaned up blood, to see if they could find any trace of a crime scene which could lead to further revelations. But the detail which firmly stands above the rest was that Dawnita Amun initially refused to hand over his daughter's cell phone when it was requested by the police. So after the detectives were able to start searching the property, with the warrant also giving them permission to access Asata's cell phone, upon checking the device, they were shocked to find that there were no call logs or texts, despite the fact that detectives had previously noted that Asata's sister had used it herself in the months after the disappearance, meaning there should have been some phone records to read through. However, despite these incredibly suspicious details, Asata's father has still not been named as an official person of interest in his daughter's case, and the young woman remains missing to this day, leaving her family understandably desperate for answers. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But after watching Jasmine Dominique's interview with the WTNH News, I am certain that Asata's family are not going to stop searching for their loved one. And given the recent discoveries made by the police, we can only hope that the truth will soon reveal itself. However, given that Asata has now been officially missing for almost 6 months, alongside the incredibly concerning details that surround her disappearance, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of her safe return is only growing weaker as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I get into the theories themselves, I wanted to quickly address the fact that we have to be extremely sensitive in this case, as I know how difficult these past few months have been for her family and they are trying to stay as positive as possible. So rather than delving too far into the darker theories in this video, I would prefer not to get lost in the gory details, as after all, the main point of this video is to raise awareness, and the last thing I want to do is cause any problems. However, saying this, one theory which I feel must be spoken about is the idea that Asata simply ran away from home and is hiding out somewhere out of fear of being sent to a military school for her bad behaviour. Now, this was a theory initially brought forward by both her father Kwabena and her mother Jasmine, as in the weeks building up to the disappearance, Asata had been clearly expressing how she wanted to leave home, so it would make logical sense if she decided to run away after an argument with her dad. But despite this being the obvious answer, there is still one question that prevents me from believing this to be the case, which is, why did Asata choose to leave the house without any shoes on her feet? Her father said he only noticed she was missing after checking the doorbell camera footage, so if it wasn't him, then who could be responsible for making her run out of the house so spontaneously? Well, perhaps Kwabena is simply lying, and made up the whole story to keep the police off his trail. After all, he was acting very suspicious after her disappearance, and even appears to have deleted Asata's phone history in preparation for a police search. But before I get too carried away, we have to be careful about vilifying a possibly innocent man, as until he is proven to be guilty by the courts, there is still every chance he may not have been involved in the disappearance at all. However, if Kwabena wasn't responsible, then what else could have happened? Well, another popular theory which I've seen being spoken about online is that she may have been spotted while she was out on the streets and then kidnapped by a passerby. Asata was supposedly on her way to a friend's house, so maybe she left without her shoes as she knew she wasn't going to have to walk far. But during the process, she was snatched by somebody who continues to hold her captive. Now, this is just about as far as I'm willing to go with this theory, but another angle that people online have been taking is that Asata could have been forced into the world of human trafficking after being promised a way out of her father's house by a person she maybe met online. We know how desperate she was to escape, so it wouldn't be out of the question that Asata, being a 16-year-old girl at the time, would seek refuge with another man if it meant she didn't have to go to the military school. But one thing I will personally say about this theory is that even if Asata did choose to leave with a man that day by rushing out of the house and straight into his car, this doesn't mean that she has been human trafficked. In fact, she could just be held up in a house by choice, and with the lack of media attention, she may be completely unaware of just how much her family are worrying about her. However, before I continue on down this rabbit hole, the fact is, we still have no concrete evidence as to where Asata could be. So for now, we can only hope that she's hiding out somewhere safe and will return home when she's ready. But until then, I believe we have to keep sharing her story, as it can only be a matter of time before the right person sees it and helps reunite Asata back with her family once and for all. On Saturday the 13th of November in 2021, A 27-year-old father named Ivie Gutierrez was supposed to be heading off for a fishing trip in Corpus Christi, Texas, when he would mysteriously disappear. At the time, he was somebody who was always in constant contact with his sister Deanna, so when he failed to respond to any of her messages that weekend, she immediately knew something wasn't right. Deanna then called the Corpus Christi Police Department a few days later to report her brother as missing. However, as he was a 27-year-old man, the police refused to act and instead told her to just sit and wait for his return. But as the weeks passed, with Ivie continuing to remain impossible to reach, Deanna's concerns only grew, eventually causing her to take the case into her own hands by talking to known friends of Ivie and asking them questions about what they knew. However, despite being provided with a number of potential leads, these stories did not seem to possess any factual evidence. And so, after over 2 years of searching, Ivie Gutierrez remains a missing person to this day. But to make matters even worse, it has also recently come to light there has been a plethora of missing person cases cropping up in and around the Corpus Christi area, which has understandably led many to wonder, could all of these similar cases be connected? And if so, what really happened to Ivie Gutierrez? Ivie Jo Daniel Gutierrez, otherwise known as JD, was born on the 21st of October in 1994 in the state of Texas, alongside his brother and loving sister Deanna. Little was known about his childhood, but from what I was able to gather, Ivie seemed to be the type of person to keep his problems to himself, as he had a deep love for his family and didn't want to cause them any worry. But outside of his troubles, Ivie was also an avid fisherman who would spend as much time as possible out on the water with his friends, and it was after meeting one of his many acquaintances that he was eventually introduced to a girl he would begin a relationship with. According to his cousin, as the relatively troubled teenager moved into his 20s, Ivie would also begin to check in on his loved ones as often as possible, as he developed a new level of maturity after bringing his first child into the world. But despite his newfound responsibilities as a father, for one reason or another, he unfortunately began to get involved in drug addiction as he was suffering from some mental health issues at the time. And in typical form, Ivie would continue to keep these struggles to himself, adamant that he didn't want to cause any panic within the family. However, it would seem that this selfless personality trait would eventually play a role in an incredibly unfortunate situation, as after being invited out by his friends for another fishing trip, Ivie would suddenly stop communicating with his family, leaving them with the assumption that he was likely going through something again. So, when he failed to return home on that fateful day in November, his sister Deanna knew right away that something was very wrong. On Saturday the 13th of November, the 27-year-old man would answer a call from one of his close friends, asking if he wanted to join them on a fishing trip that weekend. So, as Ivie was somebody who loved to fish, he immediately jumped at the opportunity and agreed to meet them over on Red Dot Pier in Corpus Christi. It is unknown if he ever made it to this location, however it would seem that later that day he would suddenly stop responding to any phone calls or text messages from his family, who were understandably concerned for his safety. At the time, Ivie had been struggling financially and was still using drugs, so he had made it a point to keep in close contact with his sister Deanna to reassure her that he was okay wherever he was. But on this particular day, every message that Deanna sent would be ignored, which was extremely out of character for Ivie and understandably caused his family to worry that he may have been in some kind of danger. So, as the days passed, with the young father continuing to stay absent, this mild concern would soon evolve into a deep fear, leaving Deanna with no other choice than to call the Corpus Christi Police Department to report her brother as missing. On Tuesday the 16th of November, the Corpus Christi PD would receive a call from a distressed woman who was concerned for her brother's safety. According to Deanna, she hadn't spoken to Ivie for a number of days, which was unusual, and given his lifestyle at the time, she truly believed that he could have been in serious danger. However, given that he was 27 years old at the time, the police refused to write up an official report for Ivie, as in their words, he was likely to return eventually, and therefore advised Deanna to just sit back and wait until he made contact. So, taking on the advice of the professionals, Deanna informed the rest of the family that there was more than likely no reason to panic, as it had only been a few days at the time. and there were many possible explanations for why Ivie would suddenly stop communicating outside of the realms of danger. But determined to get her brother home before Christmas, Deanna decided to take the case into her own hands and started reaching out to as many of Ivie's friends as possible to see if any of them knew where he could be. During this period, she was given a bunch of stories from the witnesses, but unfortunately they were unable to provide any factual evidence to back up their claims, leaving Deanna with no leads to work with, other than the fact that the last place Ivie was said to have been seen was by the Red Dot Pier in Corpus Christi. So, after gathering as much information as she could, Deanna then decided to get back in touch with the Corpus Christi detective named Alvarado and asked him if there was anything they could work with in terms of an investigation. However, despite her massive efforts, the detective once again refused to help, expressing that the police department were unable to utilize any resources in the case, given the fact that they did not have any evidence of foul play and were adamant that Ivie would return eventually. But just as Deanna and the rest of the family had suspected all along, this day would never come, as weeks would soon go by with still no sign of Ivie, leaving the family in a great deal of despair as they wondered what could have happened to their loved one. However, it wouldn't be too much longer before Deanna would finally get an update on the case, as she would receive a strange call from a supposed friend of Ivie's, who would go on to reveal something that would send shockwaves throughout the entire community. On Monday the 21st of February, just over 2 months after Ivie's initial disappearance, one of his apparent close friends would reveal to Deanna that they had been speaking to a local coroner who had found a body in the area of Corpus Christi that could not be identified. Well, as you can imagine, Deanna's heart immediately sank as she considered the possibility that this body could have belonged to her missing brother. So, determined to find out the truth, she asked for the number of the coroners and quickly hung up the phone so she could speak to the professionals herself. However, as it was President's Day at the time, she was unable to get through to the office and therefore decided to call back the following day to try again, to which she would have much more luck getting through. But despite her conversation the previous day with Ivie's friend, the coroner's office were actually surprised to receive the call and at first seemed to be very confused about what Deanna was actually asking. But after going into more detail about the situation, the coroner eventually asked her to describe her brother's appearance, to see if they had any bodies that matched the description. They then promised to call back once they'd done a quick inspection of their cadavers, leaving Deanna on the edge of her seat as she prepared herself for the worst. However, to her relief, the coroner would swiftly call back to announce that they did not have a body that even remotely matched the description of Ivie, meaning there was still a chance he was alive somewhere, providing Deanna with a small glimmer of hope once again. So, with this newfound energy towards the case, Deanna and the rest of Ivie's family gathered together from all across the country to conduct a search party, where they created and passed out flyers to the locals and asked the community for further support. But after weeks of searching with still no luck, Deanna was once again forced to go back to the police for their assistance, as Ivie had now been missing for several months at this point, and luckily, this time they agreed to conduct their own formal investigation into the disappearance. However, it would appear that this decision was already too little too late, as despite the massive efforts of everybody involved to keep the case alive, over 2 years later, Ivie continues to remain a missing person to this day. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite the rather bleak circumstances, I personally have it under good authority that Ivie's family are not giving up the fight for answers, as in recent weeks, it seems that the case has had a sudden surge in awareness due to the disappearance of another young man named Caleb Harris. However, putting this aside, you cannot deny the fact that over the years there has been very little media coverage around Ivie's case, with even some locals expressing their unawareness of the story until recently. Therefore, all we can really do at this point is continue to spread the story, hoping that it will eventually contribute to the family receiving some much needed answers around what really happened to Ivie Gutierrez. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, to kick things off, as I usually do on this channel, I will begin by discussing one of the more positive possibilities here, as no matter how bleak the circumstances may seem, until we have irrefutable evidence proving that Ivie is no longer with us, I feel we have to keep an open mind that there is still a small chance that he may return. So, with this in mind, could it be possible that Ivie is still alive out there somewhere? Well, there are arguments to be made that Ivie could have skipped town in an attempt to start a new life. I know it's a cliche, but given the fact that there hasn't been a single piece of evidence to come out in over 2 years, this could be because there isn't actually anything to find. Perhaps Ivie felt he was a burden on his family and thought they would be better off without him. So rather than telling them where he was going, he simply disappeared on purpose to start a new life elsewhere. Now, let me just say, I'm very aware of how far-fetched this theory may sound, but given the fact that Ivie's case hasn't really received too much media attention, if any at all, maybe after all these years he hasn't even realised that his family have been looking for him. However, although I would love to continue speculating on the positive theories, there really isn't too much more to say, as outside of an intentional disappearance conducted by Ivie himself, I can't think of any other conclusion that has a happy ending. Well, except for the small chance that Ivie has been held captive all this time, just waiting to be released or rescued. But if this was the case, it would imply that he has more than likely been human trafficked, which, despite meaning he could still be with us, could also mean that he is probably trapped in a very desperate situation, where the police need to act as quickly as possible to bring him home. But without any hard evidence whatsoever to back this up, we are unfortunately left to ponder the alternative theories, which in contrast are much bleaker to say the least. So if Ivie is in fact no longer with us, what could have possibly happened to him, and more importantly, who could be responsible? Well, an important point to mention here is that Ivie didn't hang around with the safest of crowds. By all accounts, at the time of his disappearance, Ivie was struggling financially, which likely contributed to his drug addictions and mental health issues, so it would seem he had found himself living rough on more than one occasion. I can't say for certain that he was homeless at the time, but Ivie was definitely somebody who would keep his troubles away from his family, so perhaps the situation was even worse than first thought. So with this in mind, it could be possible that on the day of his disappearance, Ivie got into some kind of argument with one of his friends, and due to the type of people he was associating with at the time, it's possible that one of them could have accidentally taken his life and thrown his body into the Corpus Christi waters. Now, once again, let me just clarify that this theory is purely speculation and I have no reason to believe that this was the case outside of my own personal thoughts. But if Ivie was out on the water alone with these people, anything is possible. It could be argued that if drugs were also involved, this would have been a deadly combination for everyone that was on board that boat. It is understood that it was a friend who invited him out fishing, but we can't confirm who the other attendees would have been, so perhaps uncovering these individuals would be the key to solving this case. But once again, there is currently no hard evidence to back this up, and it must be said that the family have spoken to several people who knew Ivie and were there the day he disappeared. But the stories have not been revealed to the public, as well as their names, so for now, we can only continue speculating and spreading awareness of the case. However, speaking of awareness, Ivie's case seems to have picked up in the media spotlight recently, after it was pieced together by the Corpus Christi Chronicle that there have been several identical cases of missing people over the last few years taking place in Corpus Christi, which has led many to consider if these cases could potentially be connected. In a recent post made by the Corpus Christi Chronicle dated 15th of March this year, they explained that concern is growing along Lady Bird Lake in Austin, Texas, where last year saw the mysterious deaths of 5 men, followed by the discovery of a woman's body in February of this year. They then went on to add that Newsweek reported that around 2,300 people go missing in the United States every day, and as the list continues to grow, anxiety mounts among residents and authorities alike. One example of a similar case to Ivie's was a young man named Bradley Brooks, who was last seen heading out for a late-night fishing trip in August of 2019. Days later, his abandoned vehicle was discovered on Nass Drive at the Marina Village, yet Bradley remains missing to this day despite numerous extensive searches in the following years. Another example is Jesse Albert Garcia Jr., a 38-year-old man from Pleasanton, Texas, who also disappeared during a proposed fishing trip with friends in Corpus Christi. Fears of foul play immediately emerged as his family noticed his strange silence from social media and deactivation of his phone number shortly after losing communication. To this day, his grey Nissan Frontier truck still hasn't been located, and there have been no official sightings since Jesse's vanishing. But to add to the list, there is also Patrick Harris, who was last seen near Airline Road and Williams Drive in December of 2022, with the Corpus Christi Chronicle writing that his disappearance has left a void in the community, which has fueled concerns of a potential predator lurking in the shadows. But as well as all of these troubling cases, there is one which seems to stand above the rest, due to the fact that it only recently occurred a few weeks ago, which would be the strange disappearance of the Texas A&M University student, Caleb Harris. On the 4th of March, Caleb left the house with plans to go on a fishing trip with his friends in the waters of Corpus Christi, but just like the others, he too would mysteriously disappear. And in the 3 weeks since, there has been no official sighting of the young man and no leads to follow. However, one bright spark to come out of Caleb's disappearance is that he has managed to shine a light on the injustice of many other missing people across America. For example, his GoFundMe page has successfully gained over $57,000 in just 10 days, and there have been multiple news broadcasts detailing his disappearance, with the Corpus Christi police also making great efforts to uncover the truth. Whereas with Ivie's case, they initially claimed that he was an adult and therefore refused to help, telling the family to just sit and wait for his return. But on top of this, if you compare Ivie's GoFundMe page, which was set up 9 days ago at the time of recording, you will see that his page has only been able to generate $170 so far, which in my opinion further highlights the favoritism that goes on within the police and the media. So I would like to take this time to try and make a real difference here by asking you to contribute whatever you can to this desperate family, as I know how exhausted they must feel after continuing this search for over 2 years now. But also, I can't help but feel that this is the best opportunity to raise the attention surrounding Ivie's case, as it's only a matter of time before the media inevitably moves on to the next big story. So please share this video and donate what you can, and hopefully we can help uncover the truth behind this tragic story. On Monday the 24th of April, just last year, an 18-year-old student named Janiyah Thompson was witnessed walking away from her high school after she had explained to her older brother how she was leaving early to take care of something. However, to this day she has not been seen or heard from since. Later that day, Janiyah was then captured by security cameras at the Naylor Road metro station in Temple Hills, Maryland, but it is unknown if she was able to board a train or who she was with at the time. So, after her family started to notice her absence, they reported her missing to the Prince George's County Police Department, with the hope that they would be able to find her before it was too late. But despite their desperate pleas for help, the police explained that due to Janiyah's age at the time of her disappearance, she was technically an adult, and therefore free to run away if she wanted to. So, with little help from the authorities, Janiyah's family then turned to the media in an attempt to raise some more awareness of the case by informing the public about her disappearance themselves. However, after 1 whole year of searching, the now 19-year-old is still nowhere to be seen. And to this day, the local police remain uninterested in helping bring this young woman home to her family, understandably causing the community to wonder what really happened to Janiyah Thompson. And could she be Maryland's next victim of human trafficking? Janiyah Thompson was born in the mid-2000s to her loving mother and devoted father Clinton Hubbard in the state of Maryland alongside her many siblings. Little is known about her younger years, but what we do know is that Janiyah was an intelligent and hard-working person who would go on to attend Eastern Senior High School in Washington, D.C., where she had plans of one day becoming a public servant to her country. Janiyah was a dedicated member of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, otherwise known as the ROTC, which is a leadership training and development program that prepares college-age students for service opportunities in the Army, Marine Corps or the Navy, to name a few. And given her driven personality, everybody knew it would only be a matter of time before she would graduate and move into a full-time position. But Janiyah's life wasn't perfect, as like with many people, she did suffer from some health struggles that would leave her in a concerning state if she would ever forget to take her medications. Once again, it is unknown exactly what had occurred in her childhood to cause this illness, or if it was something she was born with. But regardless of its origins, it was always evident that Janiyah would not let her health problems define her, as she would continue to battle through life despite her difficulties. However, it wouldn't be too much longer before this bright future would seem to come to a grinding halt, when the 18-year-old high school student would suddenly disappear on that fateful day in April. On Monday the 24th of April, the young woman would spontaneously decide to leave early from school after messaging her brother to explain that she needed to take care of something. Curious to know what it was, he asked his younger sister what her plans were, but for some strange reason, he could never seem to get a clear answer. But knowing Janiyah to be a well-disciplined and trustworthy person, he didn't feel too concerned by this exchange and simply accepted that she didn't want to disclose her plans, which after all she had every right to do. However, things would slowly start to evolve throughout the day, as her family would eventually notice that nobody had heard from Janiyah since she had messaged her brother earlier on in the day, and given that she was still a junior in high school, her absence was beginning to cause a stir. So, when the next morning came and her family noticed that Janiyah wasn't in her bed, everybody knew that something was very wrong, and in response to this discovery, her family began blowing up Janiyah's phone in the hopes she would respond back and confirm her safety. But to their dismay, hours would continue to skip by, with Janiyah continuing to remain silent, with nobody having the slightest of clues where she could be. So, once all other methods had failed, her family realised that they had no other option than to report her missing to the local police. On Tuesday the 25th of April, the Prince George's County Police Department would respond to a call made by the concerned family who, by now, were seriously worried about their loved one. They informed the police how Janiyah had failed to show up for school that day and had left early the day before, which was made even worse when they realised that nobody could get a hold of her on the phone. Her father also explained how this behaviour was very much unlike his daughter, and that this was much more of a cause for concern than it seemed to be on the surface. However, to the surprise of the entire family, the police would reply with an incredibly disheartening response, as they would go on to explain how, due to her age, Janiyah could not be treated as a missing child, and therefore, all the resources that would usually come with a search were off limits, at least until there was more evidence of danger. According to the police officers, because Janiyah was technically an adult, she was entitled to run away from home if she wanted to, so with this in mind, there was nothing more they could do other than offering their moral support. So upon hearing this news, Janiyah's family were left desperate for help, and with nowhere else to turn, they approached the local news stations to see if they could help spread awareness of the case themselves. And to their luck, it wouldn't be long before an interview would take place that they hoped could have potentially changed everything. On Saturday the 27th of May, Janiyah's father Clinton Hubbard would meet with a reporter from CBS News 4 to discuss his daughter's case, in an effort to try and get her story some more public awareness, as even after several weeks of inconclusive searching, the police still didn't seem too interested in the case. During the interview, Clinton would reveal that Janiyah was last seen at the Naylor Road metro station in Temple Hills, Maryland, which was approximately 3 miles away from her school in DC. According to Clinton, they had not been able to come up with any potential leads, expressing that Janiyah was known to frequent the area of Suitland, which coincidentally is also one of the more dangerous parts of Temple Hills, as it possesses one of the highest rates of violent crime. However, despite the lack of information, Clinton still concluded the interview with relatively high hopes, knowing that at the very least he was able to show his daughter's face and spread awareness of her story. But even with this boost in attention, it seemed that the case would remain cold for the following weeks, and as each day passed, Janiyah's family would grow even more desperate for answers, as they began to fear the worst. By now, Janiyah's face had been plastered all over social media, and her family would continue to share the details of the case with everybody they knew, holding on to the hope that it would only be a matter of time before a witness would come forward. However, weeks would soon turn to months, and eventually years, meaning to this day, Janiyah Thompson still officially remains a missing person, leaving a community heartbroken and a family utterly devastated, to say the least. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite the lack of leads in Janiyah's case, her family have still not given up on their search, with missing person groups such as the Missing and Black Foundation continuing to share her story to their thousands of followers. However, given that Janiyah has now been officially missing for over a year, alongside the incredibly concerning details that surround her disappearance, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of her safe return is only growing weaker as time passes. So, with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, if you're a regular viewer of my channel, then you will know that I usually like to start this portion of the video by detailing the plausibility of some of the more positive theories, as I believe until we have a confirmed conclusion, anything is possible. But just before I get into the theories themselves, I feel I have to mention the grave injustice that Janiyah's family have received from the Prince George's County Police Department, as I personally find it ridiculous that an 18-year-old girl can suddenly go missing with the police refusing to help. I understand that Janiyah is technically classified as an adult, but given that we are talking about a person that was still in high school at the time of her disappearance, I don't understand how an exception could not be made in this case. Also, given that Janiyah struggled with health problems which required her to take regular medication, surely this means that her absence would have potentially been life-threatening, which to me is more than enough of a reason to start a full-on investigation. But before I get too carried away here, the fact is a year has now gone by, so I feel the more important thing to focus on right now would be to hypothesize where Janiyah could be, and how we can get her back to her family. So with this in mind, could Janiyah Thompson have simply decided to run away from home and start a new life? Or could there be a much more sinister reason behind her disappearance? Well, based on the evidence available, it is very difficult to say for certain, as there are only a few articles about this case on the internet, and the police have not come forward to release any further details despite the fact that Janiyah has now been missing for over a year. But for argument's sake, let's say that Janiyah did simply run away from home, but why would she have ever done such a thing, and where could she be? Now, from the testimony of her father, Clinton Hubbard, it would seem that Janiyah was not the sort of girl that would just suddenly disappear without telling anyone. In fact, the evidence shows that she was a disciplined young woman who was dedicated to the ROTC training program, meaning if she had left home without mentioning anything, this would have been extremely out of character. But I suppose it's possible that her sudden decision to leave home could have been the result of her health struggles that to this day have still not been revealed to the public. She was last seen at a metro station, so perhaps she just hopped on a bus or train and fled the area in search of a fresh start. However, given the testimony of her family alongside the violent crime rates of Temple Hills, I would personally be more inclined to believe that her disappearance may not have been completely self-inflicted. A crime that is becoming increasingly more problematic in the state of Maryland is the underground practice of human trafficking, which unfortunately remains a topic that is not talked about enough due to its complex nature and lack of research. It's also very difficult to identify a case of human trafficking, as a lot of the time the victims are seen as nothing more than sex workers, and therefore do not receive the same amount of attention from the police. Usually there are also drugs involved as well, which creates even more confusion around whether these victims are there by choice or by force. But getting back to the case at hand, when it comes to Janiyah Thompson, there were never any signs that she would have ever chosen to go down this path in life, which leads me to believe that if she did somehow get tied up in the world of human trafficking, there is no way she would have ended up there on her own accord. So, if this is the case, I truly hope that it will only be a matter of time before she can find a way out and be returned to her family. But once again, before I get too carried away, I must remind you that these comments are nothing more than theories on my end, and there is absolutely no hard evidence to back them up, other than the words put forward by her family. However, I do think that these topics are worth discussing nonetheless, as I believe this helps provide a voice to those who do not have one in today's society. And if anything, Janiyah's case could be used to help raise awareness for the many women that are trapped in these conditions, desperate for a way out. But human trafficking is not the only criminal-related possibility here, as the fact remains that Janiyah went missing in an area which was located not too far from the Potomac River, and if there is anything I've learnt after covering so many missing person cases, it's that a very common conclusion to these stories is that the victims more often than not end up in a river for one reason or another. Now once again, I must express that there has been no evidence released to show that this could have been a possibility. But given the fact that Janiyah has not been seen for over a year now, with not one single sighting, I can't help but feel that there is a small chance that her life was cruelly taken, which, if true, would mean that her family may never get the closure they deserve. So with this in mind, I implore you to please help spread awareness of Janiyah's case, so that her family can get the support they need in finding out the truth about their missing loved one. On Tuesday the 7th of May in 2019, a 27-year-old woman named Paige Coffey was spotted with her abusive ex-boyfriend PJ Mason on a Home Depot surveillance camera in Cleveland, Ohio, before she would mysteriously disappear. In the weeks building up, Paige had been ignoring her family's phone calls, leading them to report her missing to the police. But when they found out that she was last seen with the same man that had put her in the hospital on multiple occasions, they began to fear the worst. However, an incompetent police department would later come out to say that despite her recent association with an ex-convict and serial abuser, they had no reason to believe that foul play was involved, and even went as far as to say that she could have been relaxing on a beach somewhere. But nonetheless, after the family continued to plead for help, an investigation would eventually begin, with the police discovering several pieces of incriminating evidence that linked back to PJ, such as the fact that he had set fire to his own car and lied about the last time he saw Paige. But despite these discoveries, he was never officially named as a suspect. So, to this day, Paige's family are still fighting for justice, as they believe that she would have never left home without saying goodbye, and therefore, 5 years on from her disappearance, they are only left to wonder what really happened to Paige Coffey, and more importantly, who could be responsible. Paige Noelle Natasha Coffey was born in the early 90s to her devoted mother Dawnita Wilkerson in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, alongside the rest of her loving family. Little is known about her childhood, but what we do know is that she attended Charles F. Brush High School, where she would later graduate in 2010 and quickly set her sights on becoming a fashion designer. According to her family, Paige was an incredibly creative person, so it was no surprise when she decided to enroll at Youngstown State University to study fashion merchandise, where she would later graduate in 2012 with a GPA of 3.1. But alongside her creativity, Paige also had a rather spontaneous streak, as well as a romantic side, which would eventually lead her to accept a proposal from her high school sweetheart, with the two deciding to get married later that year. However, her now husband was enlisted in the army, and therefore this meant that the two would have to leave their hometown of Cleveland, eventually settling in his assigned base of Hawaii, where they would officially start their life together as a married couple. At first, their relationship was like something out of a movie, and although her mother Dawnita was initially against their decision to marry at such a young age, she would eventually come around to the idea, given that Paige's husband was quickly growing into a dependable and mature provider. But unfortunately, due to the distance that now separated the young couple from their families, the pressure began to take its toll, and after 4 years of marriage, the two eventually decided it would be for the best to call it quits, with Paige deciding to head back to her hometown of Cleveland to reunite with her family. Soon after returning home, Paige then began to look for work, but given her lack of experience, it was difficult to find anything related to her passion, So given her challenging situation, she eventually made the decision to enroll herself at Lakewood Community College to study pharmacy technology with the hopes of landing a job upon graduation. However, it wouldn't be long before this once vibrant and driven woman would soon begin to lose her spark, after she met a man named Patrick Mason Jr., otherwise known as PJ, who would quickly reveal himself to be nothing less than a cancer on her life. According to her family, almost immediately after the pair began seeing each other, they noticed a sudden change in Paige's behaviour, with her once bubbly personality being replaced with a more subdued and closed-off demeanour that led her family to worry she may have been going down a bad path. Paige would begin to ignore her family's messages and would sometimes go weeks without calling her mother, which was extremely odd given that just a year prior she was somebody that would be in constant contact with her friends and family. So, noticing that there may have been something going on, they would go on to ask Paige if she was okay and if there was anything they could do to help. But in response, she simply told them that she was always breaking or losing her phone, to which her family would offer to buy her a new one so they could remain in contact. But time and time again, this pattern of silence would continue to repeat itself, with Paige eventually coming clean to her friends that her boyfriend PJ was becoming incredibly controlling and possessive, as he wouldn't allow her to have a job or drive a car, leaving her isolated and utterly dependent on him. However, despite her awareness of the situation she was in, for one reason or another, Paige refused to walk away from the relationship, and the pair continued to date for almost 2 years before a troubling incident would occur, when Paige's mother Trinetta would receive a message from PJ that would send shockwaves throughout the entire family. At some point in the early months of 2019, Dawnita Wilkerson was left startled to hear a knock at her door, and upon answering was greeted by a Cleveland police officer who was asking to speak with Paige. Surprised by this request, Dawnita then explained that she hadn't spoken to her daughter in the last few days, and that she was likely staying with her boyfriend at the time. But curious to know what the police wanted, Dawnita then asked why they needed to speak with Paige, and in response, the officer explained that her purse had been found on the side of a highway and that they had a few questions around the nature of this discovery. So, keen to assist, Dawnita then offered to call Paige on their behalf to see if she could find out where she was. But in typical fashion, Paige ignored her calls, eventually resulting in the police officer noting down the number and taking it back to the station. However, what had already started as a strange day would soon begin to get progressively worse, as the concerned mother would later receive a text message from Paige's boyfriend PJ, who was claiming that she had shot him in the head, followed by a photo of the wound and an image of a confession written by Paige herself. So, concerned for her daughter's safety, Dawnita then called the Cleveland police to ask them to inspect the situation, at which point the officers would then quickly arrive on the scene to arrest both Paige and PJ. But upon bringing her in, it was quickly discovered that Paige had been suffering from a mental episode, and that her actions likely were the result of a bipolar disorder, which explained why she was acting so hysterical during her psychiatric evaluation. But the true events of that day would soon reveal themselves, when Paige turned to her mother in the hospital and confessed that PJ had forced her to write the confession note at gunpoint, and that he had pulled the trigger on himself. Also going on to say that she had been trying to leave the relationship, but that it wasn't easy. However, despite knowing how toxic the relationship had become, and after promising her friends and family that she would not be seeing PJ ever again, this would unfortunately not be the final time that she would cross paths with her ex-boyfriend. On Monday the 29th of April, Dawnita Wilkerson would receive a request from her daughter, who was asking if she could get a lift into town as she had plans to meet up with some friends. So, more than happy to help out, Dawnita agreed, and the two climbed into the car together in the direction of Oakwood Village, where Paige had planned to go shopping. However, little did Dawnita know at the time that this seemingly innocent request couldn't have been further from the truth, as it would later be revealed that Paige had actually planned on meeting up with PJ and knew that her mother would have never approved. But to make matters even more troubling, the next day Paige would once again do something extremely out of character when she texted her mother to send her $30 via Cash App, which was certainly not something she would usually do. So, concerned that this must have meant that her daughter really needed the money, Dawnita didn't hesitate to send it across and continued on with her day as normal. However, little did she know that this would be the final time she would ever speak to her daughter, as just a week later, Paige Coffey would suddenly disappear on that fateful day in May. On Sunday the 5th of May, an old work colleague of Paige's would spontaneously decide to get in touch with her friend, as it had been a while since they had last spoken and she wanted to catch up. But as she was unable to get in touch with Paige directly, she felt she had no other option than to call Paige's mother, Dawnita, as the lack of communication had started to cause some concern. So after speaking with Dawnita over the phone, it was agreed that she would try and get in touch with Paige herself to let her know that a concerned friend was looking to get in touch. But just as before, Paige would refuse to answer the phone, and every text message would continue to get ignored. So, given the worrying circumstances, Dawnita decided to call the Cleveland PD to ask them to check up on her daughter, and given their knowledge of Paige and her unstable mental health, they agreed to do some research. At which point it was discovered that Paige had been staying with her ex-boyfriend in a cheap motel in Copley Township, and that the pair had been kicked out for an unknown reason. Now, this information was incredibly worrying to Dawnita, as she knew how dangerous PJ was, so the fact that Paige had been seen with this man was extremely troubling to say the least. But given the fact that she was alive and well, and at an age where she was able to make her own choices, there was unfortunately nothing Dawnita could do. But as the days went by, with Paige continuing to ignore everybody's attempts to get in touch, the situation would only seem to escalate, and the fear that surrounded the situation would eventually come to a head on the 12th of May, when for the first time in her life, Paige would fail to wish Dawnita a happy Mother's Day, leading the family to panic that their loved one may have been in grave danger. So, after waiting a few more days, the family eventually decided that they had no other option than to officially report Paige Coffey as missing and endangered to the Cleveland Police Department. On Thursday the 16th of May, after waiting several days for an update on her daughter's disappearance, Dawnita Wilkerson was eventually forced to make a phone call to Paige's ex-boyfriend PJ, as by now she was certain that he would have known where her daughter was. However, to her surprise, not only did PJ answer the phone, but he would go on to explain that he had no idea where she was, and that he hadn't seen Paige for months, despite the fact that he was reportedly seen with her less than 2 weeks prior at a motel in Copley Township. So in response, Dawnita then confronted PJ about how she was recently seen with a man matching his description, hoping he would fold and reveal the truth. But holding firm, PJ remained certain that he had not seen Paige for a while, and that he was unfortunately unable to help, before abruptly hanging up the phone. So, without any new information, the case continued to run cold, up until 4 days later when a friend of Paige's named Vanessa offered to call PJ herself to see if she could pull any more information out of him, and upon answering the phone, the two immediately got into the detail of their last moments together, which raised some red flags to say the least. According to PJ, he had texted her a few times, but she was apparently talking like a crazy person, and eventually she had decided to change her phone number, which conveniently explained why nobody could get in touch with her. PJ then went on to add, he had no idea where she was, and couldn't remember how long ago they had broken up, stating that he may have last seen her downtown, but couldn't be sure. So, given the vagueness of his answers, the scope of blame was only further solidified as far as Paige's family were concerned, as from this conversation it seemed like PJ was deliberately holding back information as to not bring any more suspicion upon himself. So, keen to raise the alarms with the police, Paige's family then pleaded with the officers to investigate PJ, as they were certain he had done something to their loved one. And in response, they explained how this was currently impossible as they had no hard evidence against him, but as a consolation, they did agree to hold a press conference to help raise some more awareness for the case. However, what was supposed to be a defining moment in the journey of discovery would later reveal itself to be nothing more than a hindrance, as the police would go on to make some incredibly controversial remarks during this event that would leave the entire family utterly speechless. On Tuesday the 18th of February, around 9 months after Paige's initial disappearance, the Bracknell Police Department, who were working alongside the Cleveland PD, would call a press conference to announce the disappearance of Paige Coffey, with the aim of spreading her image to the public to help create some new leads. During the event, an officer would reveal how Paige was last seen walking inside of a Home Depot in the small village of Bracknell, Ohio, alongside a man who matched the description of her ex-boyfriend, PJ Mason. It was then explained that this was the last official sighting of Paige, as after leaving the store, she was never seen or heard from again, which created some fear within the community that something dangerous may have occurred. However, despite the fact that the police were aware of PJ's past convictions, they almost seemed to play down the sense of danger by expressing how it was very possible that Paige could just be relaxing on a beach somewhere for all they knew, which, as you can imagine, caused a great deal of frustration within the family. In response, Paige's auntie stepped up to the microphone to explain how Paige would have never just disappeared without any contact with her family, and that even during her tough times, Paige would always find a way to communicate that she was okay. So the fact that she had been missing for 9 months without so much as a text message was incredibly worrying, to say the least. The police then followed up by detailing some of their efforts so far in the investigations, such as how they had conducted a few searches in the area and had followed up on numerous leads, but ultimately their efforts had been unsuccessful, which is why they required the public's help, even going as far as to offer a $5,000 reward for anybody that had information on the disappearance. However, despite the numerous attempts to raise awareness, the months would continue to go by with no suspects being brought into question. All the while, PJ was still up to his antics, eventually landing himself in prison for an assault on his new girlfriend. So unfortunately, to this day, we still have no idea what really happened to Paige Coffey, which has understandably caused her family a great deal of pain over the years, as they patiently wait for the closure that continues to elude them. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But Paige's family remain hopeful that the truth will eventually reveal itself, whether that means finding the guilty suspect or being reunited with their loved one. So until that day comes, I feel we all must continue to spread awareness in any way we can, as I personally believe that the support of the public can be an incredibly powerful tool in any missing person case. However, given that Paige Coffey has now been missing for over 5 years, alongside the concerning details of her case, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of her safe return is only growing weaker as the time passes. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, to kick things off, based on the information available, I find it very difficult to envisage any kind of conclusion here that isn't related to Paige's ex-boyfriend PJ, at least to some degree. Not only was he the last person seen with her, but he also lied to Paige's mother about when he had last spoken to her, claiming that it had been months prior when it was in fact just a few days, according to the conversation he had with Paige's friend Vanessa. But on top of this, he was also a convicted felon who possessed a lengthy criminal history consisting of several traffic-related offences, multiple robbery attempts, convictions for domestic violence, and he was even arrested for using a weapon to make someone fear for their safety, otherwise known as menacing. And so it would be safe to say that this long rap sheet had resulted in quite a few prison stints over the years. However, the controversy still doesn't end there, as PJ was also said to have burned his own car in an attempt to hide evidence, with the police being unable to trace its location after Paige went missing. Now, he claimed to have sold the vehicle to a friend, but there was never any proof of this and no receipts were ever found, so it is therefore impossible to say for certain what really happened here. But one thing that is for sure is that PJ wasn't just a menace to society, but he was also hated by his own family, as during the investigation, several of his own family members spoke to the police about his antics and how they were concerned for Paige's safety, showing just how heartless this man really was. Not to mention the fact that Paige would confess to one of her friends over text that during their relationship, PJ had apparently strangled, shot at, stabbed, beat, burned, and embarrassed her numerous times, but due to her low self-esteem and lack of options, she was forced to stay. Now, I'm sure many of you will have your own opinions on this decision, but we have to keep in mind that this is a far from uncommon circumstance, as thousands of women continue to struggle when escaping abusive relationships, whether that be due to threats against their lives or their loved ones' lives, or even just a deep-set psychological manipulation that compels them to stay. But either way, I personally believe that domestic abuse victims should never be blamed for the actions of their abusers, and so with this in mind, I hope that you will please be respectful in the comments, as no matter what happened here, Paige was certainly a victim, and therefore deserves our sympathy and support. However, despite the mass amounts of evidence against PJ, for whatever reason he has still not been convicted of anything, and the police haven't even named him as a key suspect. So based on this, could it be possible that Paige actually left on her own accord? Well, her family certainly don't seem to think so, as they came out publicly to argue how Paige would never do something like this. But given the fact that she was struggling to escape an abusive relationship, I suppose it's possible that she could have decided to run away from home in an attempt to break free from PJ. But if this was the case, where could she have gone? And why has nobody heard from her in over 5 years now? Well, one popular theory online is that she could have somehow got herself mixed up in human trafficking, although personally I don't feel there is too much credence to this theory, especially given that there is not one shred of evidence to support it. But I suppose it could be possible that Paige was just trying to move on with her life when she came into contact with somebody who had intentions to harm her. If this was the case, the key suspect for such a crime would likely be PJ, but if for argument's sake he is innocent, surely there must be somebody else at fault for her disappearance. Now at this point I must stress that there is no hard evidence for this next theory, but nonetheless, I feel it's something worth mentioning given the fact that we still have no answers after such a long time. But what if Paige has not been seen in 5 years, because after her life was taken, her body was then dumped in a nearby river or waterway? The town she was last seen in is located right on the coast of Lake Erie, plus the Grand River also isn't located too far from the Home Depot where she was last spotted on the surveillance camera. So, given these troubling details, I suppose it's possible that she could have ended up a victim, like so many others have in the state of Ohio in recent years. Now, out of respect for Paige's family, I think that's about as far as I'm willing to go with the theories, as at the end of the day they are nothing more than speculation. But I do hope that these are angles that the police have taken, as after searching for 5 years, I believe every single avenue needs to be explored in order to get to the bottom of this mystery, so Paige's family can get the closure they so desperately deserve, once and for all. But just before I end the video, I wanted to quickly mention another case that I covered last week, which honestly contains some seriously concerning similarities to Paige's case, that I'm sure you will agree are well worth looking into by the authorities as well. Now, if you're a subscriber of my channel, then you will likely already be aware of the many cases I've covered involving missing women, but for those of you who aren't familiar, I will just provide a quick rundown of one of those stories for context. So, on Saturday the 26th of June, around 2 years after Paige Coffey went missing, a 27-year-old black woman named Raja McQueen was captured on a gas station surveillance camera getting into her car in Cleveland, Ohio, but to this day, she has not been seen since. Around 4 hours later, her vehicle was spotted on the other side of town, but after enhancing the image, the authorities noticed that Raja wasn't in the car, and that the license plate had been changed. But after further examination, it was revealed that the car was being driven by an unidentified man, who was later revealed to be a possible ex-boyfriend, and bullet holes were clearly visible on the passenger side door, leading the police to worry that Raja may have been in serious trouble. However, after searching for months and tracking down this suspect, he was mysteriously released after conducting the interview, despite the fact that the police could not locate the stolen vehicle, and friends of Raja claimed that this man was abusive towards her in the past. So, just like in the case of Paige Coffey, we have another 27-year-old black woman who is last seen with an abusive ex-boyfriend on a surveillance camera in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. Also, both women were close with their families and would never disappear without telling their loved ones first. and both women have been missing now for multiple years, with not a single suspect being convicted over their disappearances. So with these similarities in mind, could we potentially have a serial killer on our hands? Or is Cleveland, Ohio just an incredibly dangerous place to be if you are a woman of colour? Personally, I'm more leaning towards the latter, but regardless of why these women keep disappearing, this should surely be a warning sign to the police departments of Ohio to step up their efforts when it comes to missing person cases, because I fear that if nothing gets done, it won't be long before we see another innocent victim disappear in Cleveland, leaving yet another family with heartbreak as they grieve the loss of their loved one. On Sunday the 14th of January, just last month, a 25-year-old mother named Marissa Carmichael would phone the police after having her belongings stolen by an unknown man and being left stranded at a gas station. However, by the time they arrived on the scene, around 40 minutes later, she was nowhere to be found. It was mentioned by an eyewitness that they saw the young woman getting into a car with a random stranger sometime after the phone call, but after checking surveillance footage, the police were unable to trace the vehicle. Marissa was then reported missing by her family after she failed to return home the next day, and so the official search began, with the police starting at the club she had been attending that night. However, after 3 weeks of investigation, the young mother of 5 still remains missing to this day, which has understandably led many to wonder, what really happened to Marissa Carmichael, and could she be North Carolina's next victim of human trafficking? Marissa Carmichael was born in 1998 to her loving mother Sarah in the city of High Point, North Carolina, where she grew up alongside her sister Emma. Little was known about her younger years, but as she moved into adolescence, her high energy and mischievous spirit would begin to show, as Marissa would quickly become the life of the party, with her close friends always expressing how kind and generous of a person she was. But her popularity certainly didn't only pertain to her female friendships, as Marissa was also very popular with the boys, given her warm personality and one-of-a-kind smile. And so, it didn't come as too much of a surprise when during her teenage years she would eventually fall pregnant with her first child. Now, for any young mother, you could imagine this would be quite a difficult transition period. However, to the contrary, it would seem that Marissa was a natural, and she would immediately fall in love with her new role as a mother and planned to build an even bigger family. So, her next child then followed around a year later, and with this new challenge, once again Marissa took it in her stride, and unsurprisingly she was quickly looking forward to having another, which is exactly what she did, 3 more times in fact. And so, at the very young age of just 25 years old, Marissa would become a mother to 5 children who she was utterly devoted to. But despite her love for her children, this didn't mean that Marissa didn't have her own life too. And as a 25-year-old woman with her high energy and love of clubbing, she wasn't unknown to spend a night out from time to time while her family looked after the kids. And given the stresses of being a mother of 5, you can certainly see why she would need to blow off some steam on occasion. However, it would be during one of these rare nights out that Marissa would suddenly find herself in an incredibly dangerous situation on that fateful day in January. On Saturday the 13th of January, the young woman had planned a night out with her friends in the neighbouring town of Greensboro, which was located around 30 minutes from her home, so she had understandably booked an Airbnb for the trip before eventually saying goodbye to her kids as she left for the weekend. After arriving, it is unknown how many different places the group visited. However, friends would later claim that they spent some time in the 117 Sofa Bar and Lounge towards the later hours of the night and then into the early hours of Sunday morning. By all accounts, the group were having a good time and enjoying themselves when they would suddenly notice Marissa talking to a man at the bar at around 3 a.m. But given Marissa's flirty nature, this certainly wasn't an uncommon occurrence, so her friends weren't too concerned and left her to the conversation, keeping an eye out from time to time. However, despite their surveillance, it wouldn't be long before the pair would eventually leave the club together hand in hand. before getting into the man's vehicle, which was parked somewhere outside. They then waited in the car for an unknown amount of time and eventually peeled off, driving east along Market Street towards the neighbourhood of Cumberland. But it would seem that the pair would eventually get into a heated argument whilst inside the car, as the driver would then abruptly pull up outside an Exxon gas station and demanded that Marissa get out, leaving her stranded without her purse or cell phone. So, frightened and panic-stricken, Marissa then ran into the gas station and asked the employee if she could use a phone to call the police, as outside of being stranded and alone in a strange and unknown town, she had also just had her purse and cell phone stolen by a man from the club, and therefore a crime had taken place and needed to be dealt with. The police then answered her call and took down all of the information before asking Marissa to stay where she was while they sent officers out to take her statement in person and make sure she was okay, to which Marissa agreed before handing the phone back to the gas station employee. But after around 10 minutes soon went by with the police still not arriving on the scene, Marissa started to get paranoid, and her panic only grew as the reality of her situation continued to sink in. After all, she was all alone without her cell phone and her home was around 20 miles away in High Point. So concerned she may not be able to get home with her kids, she struck up a conversation with a man in the store. It is unknown how long they spoke for or what the topic of conversation was, but at some point during their talk, Marissa would suddenly agree to get into a car with this man, and then they left the gas station together before the police could arrive. But little did she know that this would be the last time anybody would see her. On Sunday the 14th of January, the Greensboro police would receive a call from a woman named Sarah Carmichael, who was claiming that her daughter was not answering her phone and was very likely in great danger. Well, as you can imagine, once the name of her daughter was provided, it was quickly identified that the person in question was the very same individual that had called them at 3:45 a.m. earlier that morning to report a robbery, but had then strangely left the scene before they could question her. According to Sarah, a friend of Marissa's had called her at 5 a.m. saying there was an emergency, before the line suddenly disconnected. But even more chilling, Sarah then attempted to call her daughter numerous times to try and find out if she was okay, but to her shock, an unidentified man kept answering the phone to explain that she had gone to the store. It was then revealed by the police that earlier on that night at around 4:30 a.m, officers had arrived at the gas station where they then spoke to the staff about the situation. However, given that Marissa was seen to be getting into a car with somebody, it was presumed that she was likely getting a ride home with a friend. So rather than following up at the time, they just took a statement from the witnesses and then left the scene, not thinking too much of it. But given the concerns raised by Marissa's mother, the police then agreed to send their officers back out to the area that afternoon to do some further investigating, in the hopes that they would be able to find the young woman and confirm her safety before it was too late. Soon enough, they then arrived at 117 Sofa Bar and Lounge, where Marissa was supposedly last seen by her friends, and the police then started questioning the bar staff to see if they could provide any useful evidence. They also checked surveillance footage from that night to see if they could identify the man she had left with, but unfortunately, despite finding Marissa on the cameras, they were unable to identify the suspect she was with, and the staff were also incapable of providing any further leads for the police to utilise in the case. So with little else to uncover at the scene, the officers then returned back to their office to spread the message of Marissa's strange disappearance with neighbouring police departments, and contacted Sarah Carmichael to let her know what they had been able to find. But unbeknownst to the on-duty police officers, what they would soon discover would take this relatively common case of robbery to a whole new level of concern. On Wednesday the 17th of January, a mysterious call was made to the Greensboro Police Department with an interesting tip relating to the case, as according to the caller, the man that Marissa was seen getting into a car with that night at the gas station was actually a known criminal who went by the name of Sean. So given this massive break in the case, the police immediately set out to find this man with the hope that he would then lead them to Marissa, and soon enough, they found him. Upon interrogation, Sean claimed that after picking up Marissa from the gas station, They then drove around together for 30 minutes before he gave her some cash and then dropped her off at an apartment complex. Well, somewhat confused by the statement, the police then asked why he dropped her off at an apartment complex as opposed to the Airbnb she was apparently staying at. But in response, Sean couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation, causing the police to instantly become suspicious of the man. However, as they had no physical proof that he was involved in her disappearance, they were unfortunately forced to let him go, but very much intended to keep their eye on him going forward. As the days went by, Marissa's family continued to spread awareness of the case by handing out flyers to local residents in Greensboro and asking if anybody had seen her. But despite their efforts, it would seem that nobody was talking, leaving the family desperate for answers. But what would happen next would once again shine a light on the number one suspect, as according to some witnesses, Sean was actually seen taking down missing person flyers of Marissa, implying that he didn't want anybody looking for her for some reason, and in doing so, further embedding the suspicion that was already around him. Also, to add to the controversy, it was later revealed that the Airbnb Marissa was supposedly staying at was severely unsafe, as a person staying at the same building at the same time would actually call the police to report an incident. The operator asked what was happening there, and according to the witness, they had seen what appeared to be young girls taking illegal substances alongside much older men, which understandably caused the police to send out officers to the address. However, just as before, it would seem nothing would come of this lead, as there were no arrests or statements taken, and therefore no evidence was provided that may have assisted the authorities in their search for Marissa. Now, unfortunately, this is all we know about the case, for now, but the Greensboro Police Department did recently come out with a statement a few days ago to reveal that they are still working on the case and are urging the local community to come forward with any useful information. So hopefully it will only be a matter of time before she is finally found and brought home to her children. However, with Marissa now being officially missing for over 3 weeks, the probability of her safe return is growing more and more unlikely as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, given the details surrounding this case, I'm sure you will agree that there is one particular theory here that stands out amongst the rest, which would of course be that Marissa was kidnapped by this Sean character, who has been extremely suspicious ever since the incident took place. The obvious chain of events that could have played out here is that the man Marissa was seen speaking to at the bar could have been connected to Sean, and so after leaving Marissa stranded at the gas station, knowing she was alone and without her cell phone, the driver then called Sean to come and pick her up. Now, there's no way of knowing if this was the case, but it is certainly suspicious that Marissa would willingly get in a car with a stranger, unless she knew that this man would be the only way she would get her cell phone and purse back. Perhaps Sean identified himself as an acquaintance of the driver who robbed her, and promised to give her belongings back if she got inside. I know this may sound incredibly dangerous, but it would be an understatement to say that Marissa was in any way in her right mind that night. Just listen to the 911 call and you can immediately tell she was under the influence of something strong.
Guilford Metro 911, what's the address of your emergency?
Yes, ma'am, I needed to contact to the non-emergency number.
It comes into the same center. I can try to help you while I have you on the phone, and I can give you the
Okay,
number for
yes,
future
I don't know where I am in Greensboro. I just got all my stuff throughout the car. He took off with my phone. I have no clue where I'm at. I have no numbers, nothing.
Are you at a business?
I am at a store, yes. I'm at a Synergy.
Are you at an Exxon?
Is this Exxon?
801 East Market?
So perhaps this also affected her decision-making skills, leading her into this incredibly dangerous situation. Once in the car though, it's impossible to say what could have happened to the young mother, but it's very possible that she was then taken somewhere against her will, where she remains to this day. But despite the rather bleak conclusions that could be drawn here, that doesn't mean we can't keep a sense of optimism that Marissa may be returned home eventually. After all, it's still possible she could be alive out there somewhere, held up in a house, just waiting until the day she's released. Or maybe she's even choosing to stay hidden for the time being, as she's making good money wherever she is. But either way, at this point we can only speculate on her safety, and therefore until we know for sure that she's alive and well, we have to keep searching for answers. However, if she was in fact kidnapped by this man, what would have been the purpose? Well, unfortunately, there are only two realistic answers to this question, which I'm sure many of you have already guessed. But to be brutally honest, it would seem that Marissa has either been forced into silence for speaking to the police, or she's been forced into some kind of human trafficking scheme, where her life is now in the hands of her captors. To be completely transparent, I truly hate theorizing these types of cases because I always like to have a potential light at the end of the tunnel. But for Marissa, it's very difficult to envisage a conclusion here that ends well. From the evidence provided by the police and her friends and family, it would seem that Marissa was drugged by these men, who then took advantage of her given the fact she was alone in a town with no belongings. Now, whether or not the two men involved in the case are connected is not known, but it would seem that their behaviour was incredibly suspicious, and therefore we have to keep an open mind that they may be responsible for her disappearance. According to the state government, North Carolina is among the most affected states for human trafficking, ranking 9th in the whole country. This is due to having major interstate highways, a large military population, numerous rural agricultural areas with a high demand for cheap labour, and an increasing number of gangs, which all contribute to making it a hotbed for human trafficking. So given these statistics, alongside the concerning details surrounding this case, I don't think it would be too much of a stretch to say that Marissa has more than likely become North Carolina's next victim of human trafficking. But before we jump to any conclusions here, I feel we have to ask the question, are there any other possible theories that are worth exploring? Well, one piece of evidence provided by Marissa's very own mother, Sarah Carmichael, was that according to her, the police never even showed up to the gas station the night Marissa made that 911 call. Could the police be involved in a cover-up of sorts? Well, there isn't much more to add to this theory other than hearsay, so it's difficult to comment. However, I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility. But even more suspiciously, it has recently come out that Marissa actually attempted to get in touch with her mother from Sean's phone the night she disappeared at around 4:30 AM. But as Sarah was sleeping at the time, Marissa instead called her father, who did answer, and she told him it was an emergency, asking to speak to her friend who was at the bar with her that night and had been staying at their home at the time. The father then went upstairs to speak to this friend, who by now was already asleep in Marissa's bed, the very same friend that was supposedly out in Greensboro with her that weekend. And then he asked her what was going on, but it would seem that the friend was completely unaware of where Marissa was, and therefore was unable to provide any useful information at the time. Now, I'll be honest, I probably should have included this evidence during the earlier portion of the video, but these details have only just come to light, and I'm really not sure how accurate they actually are, especially given the misinformation that is easily spread on the internet nowadays. But if these statements are true, this would certainly bring the integrity of this friend into question, and in my opinion, would automatically involve her as a suspect in the case. Of course, I'm not claiming anything specific, and I have no evidence to back up this theory, but could the friend have conspired the disappearance alongside the men that were responsible for kidnapping Marissa? Well, it's certainly possible, and given that this friend was supposedly with Marissa that night and didn't even think to check up on her before going to sleep, this screams guilty to me. Also, you would think these two girls would have had to have been extremely close for her to be comfortable enough to sleep in Marissa's bed where her parents live, so I'd imagine she was supposed to be a trustworthy person. But how could she ever be comfortable enough to go back to the High Point residence and leave her friend in Greensboro, knowing that she didn't know anybody else there? Well, before I get carried away once again, I suppose it is possible that this friend may have been covering for Marissa. Also, I don't know how many other friends were there at the time, so perhaps she felt she was in safe hands. Or on the other hand, perhaps she knew what was happening and didn't want to reveal the truth to Marissa's parents as it would get her in trouble. Maybe Marissa had instructed her friend that she should go home and look after the kids so she could take care of business in Greensboro. I have no evidence to prove this, of course, but it would certainly explain why somebody so close to Marissa would lie to her parents. But if this is the case, what would be the reason for Marissa to just abandon her life? Well, before I attempt to answer this question, I think it would be useful to speak for a moment on a very similar case that involves another young mother that left a bar with a strange man, never to be seen again. The missing person case of DeAndrea Ford burst onto the scene towards the end of last year, when it became known to the public that a 21-year-old mother from Texas had gone missing after being involved in a murder trial where she was set to be a witness in the coming weeks. It was discussed by many that she had been taken as a means of being silenced by preventing her from testifying, but just a few weeks ago it was announced that she had actually been murdered by a local man for a completely unrelated reason. Now, this story is clearly tragic, and if you would like more information, I highly suggest checking out the video on screen now, as I go into a lot more detail about the case. But taking a step back, and why I believe this case relates to Marissa Carmichael, is that DeAndrea was also a young black mother who had left a bar late at night with a random stranger. Now, it was relatively well known that DeAndrea was a dancer and had dabbled in escorting in the past, so many believed that she had just got into the van with the aim of earning some money. But unfortunately, regardless of why she left with this man, she was never seen again. Now, I truly hope the same fate doesn't meet Marissa, but given the similar details in their stories, mixed with the concerning 911 phone call and Marissa's later phone calls claiming there was an emergency, it would seem that there is a good chance that her case may end up in a similar way. The man she was last seen with did state he had given her some money before dropping her off, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say he was paying for a service of some kind. Therefore, you could argue that this case could be a simple result of poor decision making, but equally, it's still very possible that Marissa was simply drugged that night, which would also explain her strange behaviour, and this Sean character could very well be lying in his statement. But either way, until the police reveal more information about the case, we are unfortunately only left to speculate and to continue spreading awareness of Marissa's case, in the hopes that we can one day find the answers, and in doing so, provide some much needed closure for her family. On Tuesday the 15th of June in 2021, a 32-year-old man named Eodis Harris was supposed to be walking his dogs during the middle of the night when he would mysteriously disappear. The next morning, his mother Corlita would wake up to find a missed call from her son at around 4 a.m. So, given this strange occurrence, she attempted to call him back, concerned that Eodis may have been in trouble. However, after calling and leaving multiple voicemails, it became apparent that he wasn't answering his phone, which eventually led Corlita to check her son's social media, as he was a frequent user of Facebook. But upon opening the app, she quickly discovered something that sent chills down her spine, as Eodis had left a string of cryptic messages on his Facebook page discussing the traumatic events of his recent life over the course of 81 individual posts. But the situation would only get worse when she would receive a call from the police later that day, explaining that her son's truck had been found abandoned and that his beloved dogs had also been discovered deceased nearby. However, despite leaving behind numerous clues which related to several potential suspects, spanning from his previous employers to his very own family, somehow Eodis was still nowhere to be found, and after almost 3 years of investigating, the case remains unsolved to this day. So, given the incredibly controversial details that surround this case, many are starting to wonder what really happened to Eodis Harris, and more importantly, who could be responsible for his mysterious disappearance. Eodis Trey Harris III was born on the 23rd of January in 1989 to his loving mother Corlita and father Eodis Harris II. Little has been confirmed about his younger years, but for all intents and purposes, Eodis appeared to be a happy child, sharing a close relationship with his mother and spending a lot of time with the other children in the neighbourhood. However, at some point, his mother would catch on to some feminine qualities being demonstrated by her son, and given her strong faith at the time, she wasn't sure how to handle the situation. So, fearing this behaviour may have been a result of Eodis not spending enough time with his father, in the words of Eodis himself, she then gave him up to his father, because only a man can teach a man how to be a man. However, as he continued to develop, it soon became apparent that Eodis was slightly different to the other kids, as he would start to develop some unexplained feelings for one of his neighbours, who would then go on to affectionately call him his wife. But despite this uncharted territory for the young teenager, this wasn't necessarily a problem for Eodis, as looking back, he would go on to say that this was one of the more exciting times in his life, later being quoted as saying, "I was in heaven." However, alongside these happier moments, it would appear that Eodis didn't have the easiest of childhoods, as he would later reveal that he did suffer some mental and physical abuse from time to time within the home. It cannot be clarified who exactly was at fault for this, however what I will say is that it would seem that there were certain members of the family that were more prone to turning a blind eye than others. Also, we cannot confirm for sure when this abuse actually took place, but what we do know is that these events would certainly go on to shape the man he would soon become, as Eodis would eventually graduate from college with his degree and go on to teach at Fort Worth Independent School, which is where this story takes an unfortunate turn. Eodis was always a very passionate person when it came to children, perhaps because he wanted to make sure that others didn't suffer in the same way he did. So it was no surprise when he eventually took up the role of special education teacher at Fort Worth, where he would immediately feel at home. Co-workers would describe him as a pleasure to work with, and his senior leadership team were also very impressed with his work ethic, eventually deciding to write a letter of recommendation for Eodis to be accepted into a new position within the school's doctoral program in education leadership. However, despite his drive and ambition, it would appear that these new career aspirations would eventually take a backseat, as during his free time, Eodis also ran a social media page and even had a podcast called Get Some Morals, where he would talk about a plethora of different issues ranging all the way from mental health to breaking news and pop culture. So I think it would be safe to say that Eodis was clearly a very ambitious person who wanted to do it all, and for a while, it really did seem like he was destined for great things. However, at some point during the year 2021, Eodis would get caught up in a huge controversy within the school, which would eventually result in the 32-year-old man being relieved of his position at Fort Worth, and allegedly being tagged with the label of predator, although this was never explicitly confirmed to be the case, and Eodis would continue to plead his innocence on social media. But rather than using this newfound free time to focus on his other passion projects, it would seem that Eodis would begin to sink deeper and deeper into the hole he had made for himself, as he would continuously post on Facebook about the injustice he had received, and how he would continue to fight for the safety of the students, who he would affectionately refer to as his kids. But outside of this layer of injustice, you could clearly start to see the emerging personality traits of a person that was mentally ill, as he would begin to go on rants detailing his childhood traumas, mental health issues, and family drama, over the course of around 50 posts per day, all alongside preaching the word of God. However, although these disturbing Facebook posts were incredibly worrying to his family, it would ironically be the day that they stopped, that everybody knew something terrible must have happened. On Tuesday the 15th of June, the 32-year-old man would call up his mother, Dawnita, at around 3 AM in the morning to tell her that he was walking his dogs and wanted to talk. Well, concerned by this behaviour, Dawnita asked Eodis if everything was okay, as it wasn't normal for her son to call her at such a strange hour. But despite her concerns, Eodis made it clear that he was of sound mind, and simply wanted to get some fresh air. So, accepting this explanation at face value, Dawnita continued to speak with her son for the next few minutes, until the conversation ended and Eodis went back to walking his dogs. However, at around 4 AM, the troubled man would pull out his cell phone once again, and dial his mother's number for reasons unknown. But as it was late, Dawnita had already fallen asleep, and therefore missed his call. The next morning, she would wake up at around 7:45 AM, and immediately noticed the missed call from her son. So, given his concerning behaviour in recent days, she decided to call him back to check up on his well-being. But despite numerous attempts to get in touch, each call would go to voicemail, and Dawnita was left unsure what to think. On the one hand, this could have simply been because he was asleep, After all, he was still awake at 4 AM the night before, so it was very possible that he had returned home shortly after and gone to bed. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind that told her that there was something more to this story. So, in response to her concern, Corlita then contacted other family members to ask them if they had heard from Eodis. But once again, it appeared that nobody else had heard from the 32-year-old, as they too were unable to get in touch with him. But despite her growing concerns, there was still one trick up Corlita's sleeve, as she knew that her son was always posting updates on Facebook, and upon opening the app, she quickly discovered that Eodis had left a barrage of cryptic messages on his page, discussing the traumatic events of his life, which continued well into the evening of June 15th. So, given her son's clear presence on social media, this somewhat put Corlita's concerns at ease, as although the posts were troubling in nature, at least he was still active. However, it would seem that this activity wouldn't last forever, as at some point during the following day, this long trail of Facebook posts would abruptly stop, to which Corlita would soon realise that phone call with Eodis the previous night would be the last time she would ever hear her son's voice. On Wednesday the 16th of June, Corlita Johnson would reach out to her family one last time to see if anybody knew where Eodis was or if he was okay, as it wasn't like him to stop posting on Facebook for long periods of time. But just as before, it would seem that nobody had directly spoken to Eodis since the previous day, which left Corlita alone with her imagination as she conceptualized all of the horrific possibilities that could explain the situation. However, as she sat there scrolling through her phone, a call would suddenly pop up on the screen, and upon answering, in one brief moment, all of her worst nightmares would soon come to fruition. The call was from the Fort Worth Police Department, and they quickly explained that her son's truck had been found abandoned in the town of Aspermont, around 3 hours away from his home in Fort Worth. According to Corlita, the police had received a call from the Aspermont PD to notify them about the vehicle, but given the issue with jurisdiction, Corlita was told that she would have to work directly with the Aspermont PD as the Fort Worth police had no grounds to investigate. So, with this update in the situation, Corlita immediately got in touch with the Aspermont Police Department, who told her that her son was caught on surveillance cameras abandoning his truck at a stoplight on US 83 before running out of the car with 2 dogs. According to the officers, the truck's engine was left running with the keys inside, and they also found a wallet alongside some other items that belonged to Eodis. But this was unfortunately not where the bad news stopped, as the police also mentioned that they had found the very same dogs deceased in the local area, not too far from where the vehicle was abandoned. Now at the time, they could not confirm how this came to be, but after Corlita explained how her son had been struggling with his mental health in recent weeks, it became clear to the police that this was more than likely just a simple case of psychosis, and so with this information they took to the field to see if they could locate the troubled man. However, it would appear that they didn't have too much luck, as they wouldn't be able to find anything during this initial search. But it didn't take long before the detectives would uncover another piece of evidence that would immediately add a layer of potential foul play to this already disturbing missing person case. On Thursday the 17th of June, the Aspermont PD would receive a phone call from the neighbouring police department of Paducah, as they had found a mysterious suitcase on the side of a freeway. According to the witness who had discovered it, the suitcase appeared to have been placed there as it showed no obvious signs of being thrown from a moving vehicle, as it remained in near perfect condition. So with this new update in the case, the Aspermont police began theorising if Eodis could have potentially been set up by somebody else, as not only was this suitcase discovery a suspicious piece of evidence, but they had also interviewed a group of workers who were on a nearby bridge to where the truck was abandoned, and according to them, the man who fled the vehicle did not match the description of Eodis. Therefore, with the number of concerning details increasing with each day, the police decided to upgrade the investigation from a simple missing person case to a potential homicide. And so, after a few days, they were finally able to check Eodis's phone records to see if they could locate him. However, upon examination, they soon discovered that his cell phone had pinged on the 17th of June for the final time, before it appeared to be shut off by somebody. But to make this piece of evidence even more suspicious, The cell phone had pinged in a completely different area to where the suitcase and the truck were found, and so the police were then led over to the small town of Quaynor to begin a new search. But just as before, despite the huge efforts of everybody involved, the field officers would fail in their attempts to locate Eodis, as after numerous searches scouring the towns of Aspermont, Paducah and Quaynor, the police were left empty-handed and the Harris family were left distraught. However, this would not be the end of the story, as there was still one more twist to this tumultuous case. On Tuesday the 16th of November, exactly 5 months after the disappearance of Eodis, the news platform known as Daily Blast Live would broadcast an interview with Corlita Johnson to help raise some awareness for her missing son. During the interview, she explained that despite the huge wealth of evidence that had been left behind by Eodis, for some unknown reason, the police allowed the family to come and pick up his truck, as opposed to taking it in for examination, which was something that more than concerned the news team to say the least. But despite the mistakes of the police, refusing to give up on her son, Corlita Johnson announced that she had decided to take the case into her own hands, performing searches in the Fort Worth area alongside the rest of the family, and sharing missing person posters with the public in the hopes that somebody might recognize Eodis's face and provide some new leads. Corlita also agreed to be interviewed by the Black and Missing Foundation, who promised to do everything they could to help spread awareness for Eodis. And during this interview, she would reveal one new piece of evidence that would further imply that foul play may have been involved. According to Corlita, on the 3rd of August, an unknown person attempted to log into Eodis's Facebook account, which was something that concerned her due to the fact that he had been missing for almost 2 months at the time, and so the person behind this was more than likely the same person who could have been behind his disappearance. So as the interview continued, it became abundantly clear that Corlita was convinced that somebody was behind her son's disappearance, later asking the question, who abandons their truck at a stoplight with the engine running and their wallet still inside? But once again, despite the huge efforts from everybody involved, including the countless searches and interviews conducted by Corlita Johnson herself, her son Eodis continued to remain missing, with not one single sighting of the 32-year-old to be confirmed in over 2 years. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite the alarming details that surround his case, Corlita appears to remain somewhat hopeful that her son could still be out there somewhere, as although Eodis's behaviour before the disappearance was worrying to say the least, she wants to remain positive that it will only be a matter of time before the answers will reveal themselves. However, with Eodis being missing now for almost 3 years, alongside the incredibly concerning circumstances that surround his disappearance, the likelihood of his safe return is only growing weaker as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I start, I wanted to make it abundantly clear that every theory I hypothesize in this video has been discussed by either the investigating police or the family of Eodis, because going forward on this channel, I will not be providing any of my own opinions on these cases, out of fear of causing distress to the family. But getting back to the video, there are several different theories which have been thought of by the community, with potential suspects ranging from a random attacker to somebody within his very own family. Now, out of respect for the people close to Eodis, I will try my best to remain impartial here and simply provide the details to which these theories are made up of, to allow you as the viewer to make your own decision. So starting with one of the less controversial ideas that may explain his strange disappearance. Is it possible that Eodis was the person behind his own disappearance? Well, he was certainly showing signs of mental distress in the days building up to the event. But then again, witnesses claim that another man was driving his car that day. We obviously cannot confirm this to be the case, but Eodis does appear to have quite a unique appearance, so you would think that if it was him abandoning the car, the workers would have been able to recognise his face or at least his large frame. But to this day, they remain confident that it was not Eodis in that car, and this person has never been able to be identified. Also, with the suitcase being found in a different location around 60 miles away, surely Eodis wouldn't have been responsible for this, unless he dumped the suitcase beforehand. But if so, for what reason would he do this? As far as I can tell, the police haven't revealed the contents of the suitcase, so it would be difficult to say. But these details on top of the strange cell phone ping in a completely different town the next day, which was another 44 miles away from where the suitcase was found, would seem to point this investigation in the direction of foul play. But if this is the case, who could potentially be responsible? Well, there are several possible suspects that have been discussed during the investigation, but once again, out of respect for the family, I must remind you that these theories are nothing more than speculation, and there has been absolutely no proven evidence to point in the direction of any particular suspect. But it has been argued that the disturbing Facebook posts that were left by Eodis in the days leading up to his disappearance may have triggered somebody out there to feel the need to shut him up. Eodis was mentioning his childhood traumas, so perhaps there was somebody out there who was fearful of being outed by Eodis, and seeing as he was losing control of his mental state at the time, this potential suspect may have had a motive to stop him talking. Now, this person could be a friend, family member, neighbour, anybody really, and there are no specific names to base this theory on, so we have to be vigilant that we don't point any fingers unless the authorities give us reason to. But there is also one more possible motive which I'm yet to discuss in this video, which is that alongside the mental struggles that Eodis posted about on his Facebook page, he also frequently mentioned another issue that was plaguing his life at the time, which appeared to be a heated dispute around a piece of land that he owned, or was set to own in the near future, that led him to assume that his life may have been in danger. Now, I must remind you that this theory is nothing more than hearsay, but I implore you to check out Eodis's Facebook yourself, as there are hundreds of posts detailing this potential motive in a lot more detail, and I would prefer that you make up your own mind on this one as it's incredibly controversial. But according to Eodis, it would seem that certain members of his family were jealous of the fact that he was set to receive a property from his grandfather that sat on top of an oil reserve which was apparently worth thousands of dollars. No set number was ever provided, and to be honest, it could be possible that there was no money at all. But all I have to base this theory on is the barrage of Facebook posts made by Eodis himself, where he explains that he wanted to give this money back to the community, but he was fearful that his family wanted to take it for themselves. Now, once again, I will let you make your own mind up about this one. But it is very intriguing to say the least, and it could certainly be a strong motive for somebody who wanted to get Eodis out of the picture so they could have access to this potential wealth. But before I continue down the rabbit hole of foul play, it must be stated that Eodis was a very troubled man. Honestly, just spend a few minutes on his Facebook page and you will immediately feel the distress that he must have been going through at the time. He had recently lost his job, he was being vilified as a predator by his ex-co-workers, he was clearly still struggling with his childhood traumas, and even his own family seemed to be out to get him. That is, of course, if what he said was true. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that although the behaviour of Eodis was clearly very suspicious and does seem to point in the direction of foul play, we can't rule out the possibility that what happened here may have just been the actions of a mentally disturbed man who couldn't take the pressures of life anymore. Now, I know this would be a truly heartbreaking end to such a turbulent story, but I feel it is one we have to consider, especially given the fact that the police still do not have a suspect after almost 3 years of investigating. But regardless of what happened to Eodis that day, I think one thing we can all agree on is that we need to keep searching for the truth, so his family can finally get the closure they need and put this traumatic event behind them once and for all. On Wednesday the 3rd of February in 2021, a 39-year-old mother of two named Cynthia Bah-Traore had left her teenage son at home to babysit while she stepped out to run some errands. However, despite her plans to return home at 7:30 that evening, she would mysteriously never arrive. Around 2 hours later, Cynthia's son would call his grandmother Tambra Alvoyd to let her know about the situation, as it was very unusual for Cynthia to be out this late on a weekday and to not be answering her phone. So, concerned for her daughter's safety, Tambra then called Cynthia's soon-to-be ex-husband to see if he knew where she was, and according to him, she had apparently been in some kind of accident and was recovering in the hospital. But after numerous phone calls, Tambra would continue to have no luck in tracking her daughter down, eventually deciding to wait until Cynthia reached out herself. However, the situation would only seem to escalate when the 39-year-old mother would fail to attend her divorce hearing, and it was later revealed by the police that Cynthia had actually been spotted at a gas station in Grandview, Texas, at around 10:35 p.m. the day she disappeared. The police also eventually found her car 2 weeks later abandoned next to Interstate 35 in Waco, Texas, with the keys inside and plenty of fuel in the tank. But despite the huge wealth of evidence that the police were able to uncover, after 3 years of investigating, she still remains missing to this day, which has understandably led many to wonder what really happened to Cynthia Bah-Traore, and more importantly, who could be responsible for her disappearance. Cynthia Martina Bah-Traore was born on the 14th of July in 1981 to her loving mother Tambra Alvoyd in the city of Omaha, Nebraska, where she grew up with her 2 sisters. During her younger years, Cynthia was described by her mother as an extremely carefree child who, no matter what, always seemed to have a big smile on her face, and by all accounts, she also had a very generous spirit, as on multiple occasions she would save up her allowance to buy presents for local children who were in need. Growing up, Cynthia would continue to demonstrate these traits, alongside her relentless hard-working nature, so it was no surprise that she would excel in school both academically and socially, eventually earning herself a place at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. But upon graduating, she had decided to pursue a career in teaching, which meant that for the first time in her life, she would be moving away from her home city of Omaha, eventually landing in Crowley, Texas, where she became a fully qualified teacher. But in typical Cynthia fashion, she took this new challenge in her stride once again, and continued to excel as she always had done, quickly making friends at her local church and participating in many volunteer-based roles in her spare time. According to her family, Cynthia would even go on to volunteer at a prison ministry, which she found incredibly rewarding, as religion had always been a big part of her life, so being able to share her faith with those who needed it the most was truly a blessing. But her selfless deeds didn't stop there, as Cynthia would also begin to write and produce plays for her local community, and would always make time for the people in her life that she loved. However, it would seem that this caring personality would eventually attract a man named Mussolini, that many would argue was only ever out to take advantage of her kind nature. But wanting to stand by the person she loved, Cynthia would eventually settle down with this man, and together they had 2 boys. But despite her devoted love for the family, Cynthia began to see the cracks in her marriage when she noticed that her husband had been stealing from her bank account, and on top of this, she had also discovered that he had been lying about his immigration status, as he had allegedly used false information to enter the country. But the final straw for Cynthia was when her husband started having an affair, leaving her with no choice but to file for divorce. And it is at this point that our story takes an even darker turn, as just 2 days before the final hearing, Cynthia would mysteriously disappear. On Wednesday the 3rd of February, the 39-year-old woman said goodbye to her children as she headed out the door with the aim of returning home by 7:30 p.m. after running some important errands. Little was known about where she went that day, but once 7:30 had rolled around with still no sign of Cynthia, her eldest son noticed that this was very unusual for his mother, as given her job as a teacher, this meant that she was almost always on time. But assuming she may have just gotten stuck in some traffic, he wasn't too worried about it at first, and continued on with his night, relatively unfazed. But after noticing that the time had soon flown by, Cynthia's son quickly realised that she was now over 2 hours late, which understandably caused him a great deal of concern given how unprecedented this behaviour was. So, after attempting to call his mother with no success, he then decided to call his grandmother, Tambra Alvoyd, who was back in Nebraska at the time, to tell her about the situation in the hopes that she may have spoken to Cynthia and knew where she was. But once again, there would be no success, as Tambra had absolutely no idea why Cynthia wasn't answering her calls or why she would be so late returning home. So, concerned for her daughter, Tambra then assured her grandson that everything would be okay and that she would get to the bottom of this mystery. She then called every single family member or friend that may have known where Cynthia was and asked them if they had been in contact with her, but every conversation would unfortunately end the same. So with nowhere else to turn, Tambra swallowed her pride and dialed her daughter's soon-to-be ex-husband to see if he perhaps knew where she was. But the response she would soon receive would send shockwaves throughout her body, as according to Mussolini, Cynthia had actually been in an accident and was in the hospital recovering, which explained why she hadn't returned home and why she was unable to take any calls from her family. So, relatively relieved to hear that her daughter was alive, but still concerned for her health, Tambra then asked which hospital her daughter was at so she could call them directly to get an update. But strangely, after calling the local hospital in Crowley, the staff were unable to connect her as they were having trouble finding Cynthia on the system, advising her to try calling back later. However, little did Tambra know at the time that the reason they couldn't find Cynthia on the system was because she was never there. On Friday the 5th of February, Tambra Alvoyd would receive a message from one of her family members claiming that Cynthia had failed to show for her final divorce hearing that had been scheduled for months. Up until this point, Tambra had quietly held out hope that her daughter would have had to have come out of hiding for her divorce proceedings, as she knew how desperate Cynthia was to move on from her husband. So, when she didn't show, this set off some major alarm bells across the community, as despite believing she was at the hospital at the time, nobody had actually seen her since the night she walked out. With this in mind, Tambra then decided to try calling the hospital again, as she had been doing continuously throughout the previous 2 days. But just as before, the staff still couldn't locate Cynthia and had no record of her ever checking into the hospital. But on the following day, after several more attempts to get in touch with her daughter, the truth finally seemed to emerge, as a nurse would call Tambra back herself to confirm that not only was Cynthia not in the hospital, but that she had never even checked herself in. So upon hearing this troubling news, the reality of the situation quickly hit Tambra, as she realised that her daughter had been officially missing now for 3 days, meaning they had lost some valuable searching time and that Cynthia was more than likely in grave danger. But the situation would seem to go from bad to worse, when the grief-stricken mother would receive a phone call from the Crowley Police Department with news that would shake Tambra to her very core. On Saturday the 6th of February, the Crowley PD revealed to Tambra Alvoyd that a woman matching Cynthia's description had been captured on surveillance cameras getting into an unknown vehicle at a Shell gas station in Grandview, and according to the cashier, she had also left her cell phone on the counter. With this new information, I think it would be safe to say that the family were overwhelmed with worry, given that their loved one had disappeared without her cell phone and therefore had no way of contacting anybody if she was in trouble. So, given the escalation of the case, Tambra assumed that the police would step up their investigation, as Cynthia would have never left her kids behind, meaning the only other option was that she had to have been abducted by somebody that day. But despite their assumptions, the police surprisingly showed a complete lack of urgency towards the situation, with days soon turning into weeks, with very little progress being made in the investigation. According to the family, at this time they felt truly abandoned by the authorities, as they found it very difficult to believe that there could be no leads in a case that was so controversial. But despite the lack of effort on the police's side, Tambra and the rest of the family were determined not to give up, so they continued pressing the police for answers every single day, and eventually, they found some success, as the police would provide the family with 2 recordings from the night of Cynthia's disappearance at the gas station in Grandview, where you could clearly see her entering the store. But unfortunately, there really wasn't much else to see. And according to the family, there were supposed to be several other tapes that were not shared by the police, as they were being withheld for evidence. So, despite their efforts, Cynthia's family were once again sent back to square one, with very little knowledge of what happened that night, outside of the fact that she may have gotten into a stranger's vehicle. But even that wasn't confirmed, as the tapes were being withheld, so for all they knew, it was still possible that Cynthia could have got into her own vehicle at the time. Days would then pass with still no updates from the police, and the family's frustration only grew as their hope began to slowly fade. But thankfully, it wouldn't be too much longer before they would finally receive some more news from the Crowley PD, but their excitement would soon turn to dread when the police announced that they had made another startling discovery. On Sunday the 15th of February, a Texas Ranger on patrol would stumble upon what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle on the side of Interstate 35 in Waco, Texas. It was a metallic blue Mazda CX-5 with a Texas license plate, and after calling into the office, it was quickly revealed that this vehicle actually belonged to Cynthia Bah-Traore, who at this point had been missing for 12 days. So, given the troubling circumstances surrounding the vehicle, the police then gained access and searched the interior for any clues that may have led them to finding Cynthia. But upon entering the car, they were immediately shocked to see that the keys were still inside, along with a fuel tank that still had plenty of gas. The police then estimated that the vehicle was likely dropped off at this location between the 11th and the 15th of February, but rather controversially, rather than contacting the family right after finding the car, they instead chose to keep this evidence to themselves and only finally revealed their discovery 10 days later. But even more surprisingly, when explaining what they had found, the detective clearly stated that there were no keys found in the vehicle and dismissed any chances of foul play being involved, also stating that further examination was not required due to the cleanliness of the car and advised Tambra to pick up her daughter's vehicle later that day. However, it would seem that Tambra was far from satisfied by this explanation, as she would go on to question why she was only being told about this now, as according to Tambra, she had been calling the police daily for updates, and despite knowing what they knew about the vehicle, they chose not to tell her, which she found incredibly suspicious. But determined to keep her daughter's case alive, Tambra then begged the police to keep the vehicle and to run DNA testing to try and find any potential suspects that could have been driving the car that day, expecting her request to be met with understanding. However, despite her pleas, it would seem that the police were still not interested in pursuing this angle any longer, and insisted that she pick up the car at her nearest convenience, leading Tambra to feel like she had no other choice than to take her case to the mayor of Crowley. But after ultimately choosing to side with the police, Tambra realised that no authority figure was willing to take the case seriously, leaving her with a feeling of helplessness once again. So, refusing to give up hope, she then directly contacted a few DNA testing labs herself to see if they would be willing to test the vehicle for evidence, and initially, they expressed a strong willingness to help in the case. However, after speaking with the Crowley Police Department, the lab very controversially decided to reverse their decision, explaining to Tambra that the results of any testing would not provide admissible evidence to the courts, and therefore they refused to conduct any tests on the vehicle as originally promised. So once again, Cynthia's family were left deflated and hopeless, as it seemed that every single lead they would try to follow up on would immediately be shut down, meaning they were running out of options and were left at the hands of an unprofessional and unwilling police department that would continuously express their disinterest in the investigation. But there was still one more twist to the story that nobody saw coming, as Tambra would eventually decide to get in contact with the gas station cashier that had apparently called the police to report Cynthia's missing cell phone. But upon speaking with this man, she would soon find out some more information that would shine yet another light on the incompetence of the Crowley Police Department. On Thursday the 4th of March, the gas station cashier from the night Cynthia disappeared, named Ali, expressed to Tambra Alvoyd that he had in fact spoken to Cynthia that day. However, he did not remember her leaving her phone on the counter, and therefore he also did not call the police to report anything. So with this information, Tambra quickly realised that this meant the police had lied to her once again, and so she immediately called the detective to try and get to the bottom of this inaccuracy. But rather than receiving an apology, she was instead sent an email by the police that explained how they had made a mistake in their reporting, as the cell phone had actually been left inside a vehicle that Cynthia had climbed into that night. According to the email, she had actually got into what appeared to be a stranger's car at the gas station, and after leaving her cell phone inside the vehicle, that driver then called the police to report it. But this still didn't explain why they made up this story about the phone being reported by the cashier, as it simply didn't make any sense whatsoever. So, after reading the email and gathering her thoughts, Tambra then called up Lieutenant Tate, who was the person that was supposed to be overlooking this investigation. But despite Tambra's very understandable concerns, they surprisingly responded to her phone call with an extremely unprofessional outburst, where in their anger, they expressed their personal belief that Cynthia had left on her own accord that night, and therefore she would not be returning anytime soon. This then coupled with the fact that the police were not going to be looking into the case any further, as they believed it was a lost cause. And so, in this moment, Tambra realised that the police department had been working against them the entire time, and with the case now being over a month old, the reality of the situation had suddenly hit home, as Cynthia's return was now looking extremely unlikely. But the controversy didn't stop there, as in January of the following year, it was also revealed that the police had failed to send Cynthia's dental records over to the National Missing Persons database, despite promising to do so 10 months earlier. So, with this case being mishandled to such a huge degree, it was unfortunately left up to Cynthia's family to continue the search, with Tambra conducting several interviews with different media outlets to help spread the story. But despite these massive efforts from the family to keep the case alive, over 3 years later, Cynthia still remains missing to this day. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But one thing that is for sure is that Cynthia's family will continue to fight for justice, regardless of how many setbacks they receive, which I for one think is incredibly courageous and deserves to be highlighted. However, in the years since her disappearance, you cannot deny the fact that there has been very little media coverage around the case, with even some locals expressing their unawareness of the story. Therefore, all we can really do at this point is continue to spread the story, hoping that it will eventually receive the attention it deserves, and in doing so, perhaps we can finally get some answers around what really happened to Cynthia Bah-Traore. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, going forward on this channel I will only be discussing the theories that have been talked about by either the investigating police or the family themselves, as I do not want to cause any harm to the people connected to this case. So, with this in mind, there are two main theories which seem to stand out amongst the rest, which is that the police were somehow involved, or Cynthia's ex-husband could have been behind her disappearance. But to start with the latter, I think there are numerous arguments that point suspicion at Mussolini due to the coincidental nature of Cynthia's disappearance. As I mentioned previously, the hearing was supposed to take place on the 5th of February, and it is to my understanding that this would have been the final session before signing the papers and making the divorce official. So, the fact that she disappeared just 2 days before could suggest that her ex-husband may have been behind this, as he would have surely not been very happy to lose custody over his kids, or any of the other possible consequences of signing these papers. But to add to this, he also lied to Cynthia's mother about where she was, by stating she was recovering at the hospital, as this was later revealed to be completely false, meaning Mussolini was clearly trying to hide something. We also know from Cynthia's family that this man was a proven liar and manipulator, as he had falsified his immigration papers in the past. He had stolen money from Cynthia's bank account, and he had even had an affair behind her back. So, all of these details alongside the fact that he was set to lose custody over his children would surely provide a strong enough motive for Mussolini to make his soon-to-be ex-wife disappear. Unfortunately, this is a relatively common occurrence with missing person cases that involve divorce, so given the details surrounding this particular case, it certainly wouldn't be too surprising if he was guilty. However, taking a step back from this theory, regardless of whether or not Mussolini was behind this, the question that still remains is why were the police so unhelpful in their investigation, and why were they so certain that Cynthia had simply vanished on her own accord? Well, in order to answer these questions, we would probably require an interview with the police themselves, as from my research there isn't any mention of an explanation as to why they behaved so unprofessionally. It could be that they were simply overwhelmed with other investigations at the time, or maybe the officers just weren't prepared for a case of this nature. But either way, the manner in which they handled Cynthia's case was nothing short of despicable. Firstly, they didn't provide Tambra Alvoyd with all of the surveillance tapes at the gas station, meaning she was led to believe that her daughter had simply driven off on her own after forgetting her cell phone on the counter. But this was later revealed to be a lie, as Cynthia had never even left her cell phone at the gas station, as it was later explained that she had actually got into a stranger's vehicle and left her phone in this person's car. Perhaps the surveillance tapes would have proven to Tambra that the police had lied about their report, and so they wanted to keep it under wraps. Also, the police had initially promised to share Cynthia's story with the media, but after weeks of searching, the police had still not fulfilled their promise, leaving the family to have to reach out to the media themselves. This time delay could have very well been the difference between Cynthia being found or not. But one final argument to be made is that the police also didn't send Cynthia's dental records over to the National Missing Person database, as they had once again promised to do earlier on in the case. Instead, it took them almost 1 year to finally send the details over, showing just how uninterested they were in the investigation. One of the detectives even went as far as to say to Tambra herself that they believed Cynthia had left on her own accord and showed very little compassion for the grieving mother despite her desperate pleas for help. So with all of these details combined, I think we can all agree that this case could have been handled much better by the Crowley Police Department, as perhaps if they took it more seriously, we wouldn't still be here 3 years later asking questions that should have been answered back in 2021. But speaking of this year in particular, as I was researching Cynthia's case, I couldn't help but notice some parallels between her story and another, about a man named Eodis Harris, who had also disappeared from a town near Crowley just 4 months later. Now, if you're subscribed to the channel, then you would have probably seen my previous upload which covered the disappearance of Eodis Harris in a lot more detail. But if not, then I highly recommend checking out the video on screen now, as I'm sure you will be able to identify even more similarities in their cases that I haven't mentioned here. But either way, just for the sake of context, I will quickly provide a brief rundown of his story. So, on the 15th of June in 2021, a 32-year-old man named Eodis Harris was supposed to be walking his dogs during the middle of the night, when he would mysteriously disappear. The next morning, his mother Corlita would wake up to find a missed call from her son at around 4 AM. So given this strange occurrence, she attempted to call him back, concerned that Eodis may have been in trouble. However, after calling and leaving multiple voicemails, it became apparent that he wasn't answering his phone, which eventually led Corlita to check her son's social media, as he was a frequent user of Facebook. But upon opening the app, she quickly noticed that Eodis had left a barrage of cryptic messages on his Facebook page, discussing the traumatic events of his life, including his recent dismissal from the Fort Worth Independent School District. But the situation would only get worse when she would receive a call from the police later that day, explaining that her son's truck had been found abandoned with the keys left inside the vehicle. However, despite leaving behind numerous clues which related to several different suspects, somehow Eodis was still nowhere to be found, and after almost 3 years of investigating, the case remains unsolved to this day. Now, you may have already spotted a few similarities in that quick summary, such as the fact that both of their vehicles were left abandoned with the keys inside, but I can assure you, there are several more details that are even more suspicious. So firstly, both Cynthia's story and Eodis' story took place in Texas, just outside of Fort Worth, where they both worked as teachers, and were both affiliated with the Fort Worth Independent School District. Now, an important point to add here is that Eodis was fired from his teaching position at the school, as he was saying some incredibly controversial things on his Facebook about their quote-unquote dark secrets, with many arguing that this was the real reason behind his dismissal. I should say that this is only speculation, but given that he would disappear just a few days after leaving a string of posts aimed at vilifying the school, it is certainly suspicious that he would go missing within such close proximity. However, on top of this, another similarity in their cases is that after they went missing, there was very little police involvement and even less media attention, which, considering the controversial details surrounding their cases, this to me seems extremely odd. Surely every news broadcasting network would have wanted to cover their stories, but for some reason, in both cases, the families had to reach out for media coverage themselves. Now, another more superficial point to add would be that both victims were people of colour and in their 30s, which, although maybe nothing more than a coincidence, could also be the reason why they received less media attention than they deserved. You could also argue that both Eodis and Cynthia may have been targeted due to their skin colour, but this has not been a proven theory talked about anywhere from what I've seen, so I think I'll leave that one up to you to debate in the comments. But regardless of whether or not you agree that these cases possess some eerily similar details, I think one thing we can all agree on is that these missing victims have families that are still without closure after 3 years, and so we need to do everything we can to keep their stories alive until we can finally get some answers. So with this in mind, please feel free to share these stories with anybody you know that might have some information worth presenting to the family. I will also leave a link to their GoFundMe pages where you can leave donations and contact them directly with any evidence you may have. Anyway, with that, I think I'll leave this video here, but please let me know your thoughts in the comments and if there are any other cases you would like me to cover. There were many more stories that I wanted to include in this video, but given the 3-hour runtime, I thought it would be better to focus on the cases that received the least amount of exposure on my channel across 2024. So if you would like another compilation video, make sure to let me know in the comments and I can get a part 2 out before the end of the year. But until next time, thank you so much for watching and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss my next video.